Did you know? Aron, Lyron, and Agron are partly based on a mythical creature prominently featured in Korean fables. This beast, known as the Bulgasari, would eat iron and grow from the size of a bug to the size of a house, causing havoc. The Agron line of Pokemon reflects this. Aron's Pokedex entry in Pokemon Ruby states, to make its body, Aron feeds from iron ore that it digs from mountains. Aron is also small, being only about a foot tall, and ultimately evolves into the almost 7-foot tall Agron. Although these Pokemon are inspired by the myth, Agron's design might be directly based on a theatrical depiction of the monster. Bulgasari is a 1985 movie made in North Korea. The film shows the titular creature creating destruction after being summoned by an imprisoned blacksmith. Bulgasari in the movie is a giant beast with horns on its head, plating on its shoulders, and a thick sweeping tail, just like Agron. What's also interesting about the movie is that it was produced by Kim Jong-il, the former dictator of North Korea. Kim actually kidnapped the director of the movie and his wife and forced them to make the movie alongside several others. It wasn't until after making 7 films for Kim that the two managed to escape. Although nowhere near as extreme as Bulgasari's production, the development for Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire also had its issues. The shift from Game Boy to Game Boy Advance presented some problems for Pokemon's developers. While the Advance brought new possibilities to Game Freak, those possibilities also came with greater resource costs compared to the previous games. To lessen the workload, Ruby and Sapphire retained the simple art style of the Game Boy games. If the world became more realistic, it would mean more detailed, time-consuming art would have to be made. The backgrounds for the battle screens were kept simple as well. If the battle areas were over-detailed, they would resemble specific locations in the overworld rather than a generic theme. By making them vague, the team could also use them in a wide range of locations rather than specific spots on the map. An increased workload wasn't the only problem the games faced. At the beginning of development, the series' public perception was at an all-time low, with many denouncing Pokemon as a fad or anticipating a sharp decline in popularity. Junichi Masuda, Ruby and Sapphire's director, even recalled seeing large amounts of Pokemon products disappearing from toy stores and being replaced with the latest Star Wars figures. The pressure of seeing this actually gave Masuda health issues, and he needed a gastroscopy due to stress-related stomach pains. Nevertheless, he resolved to prove the critics wrong and continue the series. Masuda planned for Ruby and Sapphire to be the launching point for the next few games in the series. He always intended to follow it up with a 4th generation and hoped to be able to remake the original games in between so that players could transfer older Pokemon to the new games. Masuda's plan was instantly at risk after discovering the titles Ruby and Sapphire might be unavailable due to copyright issues. The region of Hoenn was based on Kyushu, the southernmost major island of Japan. Masuda's grandparents lived in Kyushu, and he created Hoenn in an attempt to recapture many of his experiences vacationing there. A lot of this time was spent fishing and hunting for insects, just as the player does in Pokemon. Masuda even snuck in one of his family members as a cameo. Kiri is a girl in Sidopolis who will give the player 2 berries daily. The character is named after Masuda's daughter, who was born as Ruby and Sapphire neared completion. There was only debugging work left to do at the time of her birth, so it would have been risky to implement a new character. Nevertheless, Masuda secretly programmed the character into the game. Although Masuda would have some fun developing the game, the lingering pressure would still affect him. The day before the game's released, Masuda had nightmares about it failing. The art team got the inspiration for many of the new Pokemon from animal encyclopedias, their own childhood experience, as well as cartoons and movies. These Pokemon were designed with a more unique look than in previous generations, but without overstepping boundaries or betraying Pokemon's design philosophy. Ruby and Sapphire included only 202 of the total 386 Pokemon. Choosing this number was difficult as the developers had to balance the creature variety against the difficulty of completing the Pokedex. They also had to strike a balance between introducing new creatures and including enough old favorites to satisfy fans. Another issue was that every time they'd create a new, strong Pokemon, they'd need to create a counter for it as well. The team were also wary of making the new Pokemon overpowered, as that might encourage players to use only a single member of their team. Concept art for Ruby and Sapphire show different designs for Torchic, Trico, and Groudon, as well as a strange Pokemon that appears to be a combination of Latias and Blaziken. Other ideas that didn't stick include a feature where a Pokemon would make a different cry depending on its state. A healthy Pokemon would make a happy cry, where a sad Pokemon would sound different, but this idea had to be dropped due to memory restrictions. Game Freak considered changing core conventions of the series, such as the number of Pokemon players could have in their party, and the number of moves each Pokemon could learn. After some experimentation, they decided to stick with the original mechanics, as changing them didn't make the games more fun. Ruby and Sapphire's internal list of Pokemon is in a completely different order than the final Pokedex. It seems that Chimiko was a late addition to the games, as it's the final creature to appear on the list, even after the legendaries. There's also evidence that double battles against wild Pokemon were planned to be in the game, as the feature is referenced by a string of text in the game's files. Wild double battles would eventually be featured in later games in the franchise. Ruby and Sapphire were also planned to have additional weather effects for the overworld, including a unique snow effect, suggesting the game was planned to have a snowy area. This is further supported by an unused type of trainer called Boarder, whom were likely snowboarders. Tracks from Pokemon Gold and Silver can also be found on the cartridge, which are remixed using Ruby and Sapphire's sound font. However, it is possible that they were just used to test the game's audio. This seems to be a tradition in the series, as Diamond and Pearl also include a remix of the Ruby and Sapphire title theme in their files. The games also have several regional differences. Ruby and Sapphire have 3 decorative dolls based on Regirock, Regice, and Registeel that can only be obtained through the use of the GBA's e-reader peripheral. The e-reader cards for these dolls were only released in Japan, making them elusive in the West. The Japanese versions of Ruby and Sapphire also contain some minor issues and glitches that were fixed in other versions. While riding the acrobike along the beach in the Japanese versions, it's possible for players to bring up the option to surf. By doing so, the player is able to surf on land, which can only be undone by entering a building. In the beginning of Ruby and Sapphire, the player character's family moves into a new house with the help of a few Machoke. In the Emerald version, these Pokemon were changed to Vigoroth, but developers mistakenly still used Machoke's cry in the Japanese version. Not all of the game's glitches could be fixed for the international versions. In Ruby and Sapphire, anytime the player attempts to sell 256 or more of an item, no matter how much money the game says is being paid out, the actual amount will be 0. This means if the player attempts to sell 257 berries, for example, the amount will roll over and they'll only be paid for 1 berry. Speaking of berries, Ruby and Sapphire possesses the honor of having the first glitch in the series to be fixed via an official update. Due to an error with the game's internal clock, daily events such as gifts from NPCs or the growth of berries on trees will simply stop. The clock keeps track of the year, month, day, hour, minute, and second, but the years, months, and days are converted into a single day counter. The year, month, day conversion function has a flaw, however, and years are only counted after the first year has ended. So, after a year of play, the counter goes back to 0. Because berries are programmed to grow according to the amount on the day counter, if the player planted any berries on the last day of the year, the game won't make the berries grow any further until the counter reaches the same value when the seeds were planted, which takes another entire year. This is infamously known as the berry glitch, due to the fact that most players notice it when the berries stop growing on trees. The glitch was a big enough problem that Nintendo issued an update specifically to fix it. There were several ways for players to receive this update. In Pokemon Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald, holding down both the Select and B buttons on the title screen will allow the update to be transferred to a copy of Ruby or Sapphire through a link cable. Connecting the games to Pokemon Coliseum, Pokemon Box, or PAL builds of Pokemon Channel will download the update automatically. Certain Nintendo GameCube demo kiosks also came with an option to download the update to a connected copy of Ruby or Sapphire. If the player opted to go through the kiosk option, they'd be gifted a shiny Zigzagoon. And lastly, if none of these options were available to the player, they could simply mail their copy of the game to Nintendo, who would update their game and send it back.
Did you know? The Minish are likely based on a race of tiny humans from Ainu folklore known as the Koropok Guru. Like the Minish, these beings are often portrayed as carrying leaves and as small as thumbs. It's also possible that Minish Cap's developers took inspiration from European folklore. The Minish that live in towns behave very similarly to the brownies of British legend and similar European tales. Brownies are said to help with household tasks and try to please people in exchange for gifts, but hate being seen. These same traits can be seen in the Minish, although they seem to act more selflessly. At one point in the game, the Minish help the shoemaker Rem finish the Pegasus boots as he sleeps. This plot point is based on the Brothers Grimm tale, The Elves and the Shoemaker. In the tale, a poor shoemaker repeatedly buys leather, goes to bed, then wakes up to a finished pair of shoes in the morning, which he sells for a high price. He eventually finds that elves have been making the shoes for him at night. The shoemaker and his wife then decide to make clothes for the elves to thank them, but this gesture frees the elves of their servitude, and the shoemaker never sees them again. The Minish race inspired other Zelda games and led to the creation of a new race that was cut from The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The game's director Hidemaru Fujibayashi explained, "Since Breath of the Wild is a 3D game, we could have all these tiny-sized towns, and Link himself could shrink. But with all these other characters that stand out, we thought it would be difficult for these little guys to live out their own place in the game. So we really wanted to have them in there for the gameplay, but sadly had to give up on the idea." The idea to make Link change sizes in Minish Cap came from the team at Capcom wanting to keep in line with Zelda tradition. Zelda games often have Link go between two worlds, such as a light and a dark world, or the past and the future. A contrast between big and small was chosen early in development, and this concept guided the title's production. Capcom took a different approach when developing the game, however, and made copious amounts of concept art. Nintendo usually make far less, and opt to create game assets from scratch to save time. Although the game seems to take cues from the Wind Waker and uses many of its characters, the world of the Minish Cap was designed to have its own unique identity. Developers then decided to bring in residents from Wind Waker that fit Minish Cap's atmosphere and made them part of the world. The Minish Cap is one of the only games in the Zelda series to be released in Europe before the United States. This was due to the launch of the Nintendo DS, which came out in December of 2004 in the US. Nintendo of America delayed the release of Minish Cap so that the two products weren't competing with each other. Conversely, the DS wouldn't launch in Europe until 2005, and Nintendo of Europe wanted to push the Minish Cap as a major release for the holiday season. The Minish Cap was also available in Europe as part of a limited edition release that included a special Zelda-themed Game Boy Advance SP. Out of all of the limited edition packages produced, 6 of them contained a special golden ticket. Anybody who found one of these tickets would receive a 24-karat gold-plated Game Boy Advance SP. Only 7 of these systems were made. 6 were given to golden ticket holders, and the 7th was given away as part of a magazine promotion. As a side effect of its early release, the European version of Minish Cap is actually an earlier build of the game, and contains several glitches not found in other versions. If the player tries to fuse kinstones with the character Eni, then cancels and leaves the screen, they'll be unable to fuse kinstones with him again. This makes one of the game's side quests impossible to complete. Another example is if the player uses the boomerang or bow immediately after lighting the lantern. This will allow them to perform several tricks, such as levitating in midair or shooting double arrows. Some regional differences also hint at unused content. The description for the Ice Wizrobe figurine in the European game says, "They're weak against fire, so hit them with your fire rod." There's no fire rod in the final game. However, there is a fire rod in the game's data. Graphics, text, and even some functionality for the fire rod are still in the game. Because the fire rod is similar in function to the lantern, it's believed the lantern replaced the rod towards the end of the game's production. The game also has a crudely drawn unused character that wears only a cape, hat, and trunks. The character was most likely used for testing purposes early in development. 3 items used to debug the game still exist within its data. They're named Cell Overwrite Set, Enemy Set, and Mega Crush. Only Cell Overwrite Set is still functional, and lets the player copy and paste surrounding tiles and edit the environment. Some of the Minish Cap's unused content also references other games. There are 3 unused stained glass windows. These were originally meant to be part of Hyrule Castle, and depict Valu, Jabun, and the Great Deku Tree from Wind Waker. Similarly, the 3 Goddess Pearls from Wind Waker also exist within the game, but are left unused. It's unclear whether they would have played a significant role in the game. Zols, Gels, and Podoboos from The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords also exist in the code of Minish Cap. By hacking, the Zols and Gels can be spawned in one of 3 colors, and the Podoboo can be modified to split into a different number of mini Podoboos when hit. There's an interesting secret in the Caster Wilds area that can't be seen under normal circumstances. Outside of the playable area of the cave, there's Japanese text that says Mogura, which means mole. Considering the cave needs to be dug out, this writing seems to be a reference to the mole mitts item. There are additional references that made it into the game. The mushroom-like puffstool enemy shares its name with a similar-looking creature from the Pikmin games. However, these enemies do not share a name in the Japanese versions of their respective games. This means either the localization team wanted to add in a nod to Pikmin, or they reused the same name by accident. Another possible reference is that Vati's laugh seems to be a shortened version of the Happy Mask Salesman's laugh from Majora's Mask.
We have a bunch of new information on Game Boy Advance games for you coming up in this episode, but we're going to kick things off with some newly translated details about the Game Boy Advance itself. These details come from a great interview we had translated from 64 Dreams' April 2001 issue. Taking part in the interview are 3 men who were essential to the Game Boy Advance's design and development: Satoru Okada, Kenichi Sugino, and Ryuji Umezu. Okada in particular is a true Nintendo OG. He had a hand in creating the Game & Watch, Game Boy, and every other Nintendo handheld up to the DSi XL before he retired in 2012. Okada begins by saying Nintendo had been, quote, experimenting with colorization constantly since 1994. Right off the bat, this is pretty interesting. Development on the Game Boy Color started in 1996, but Okada says Nintendo was testing the waters a whole 2 years earlier, and we think we know what he's alluding to. The time frame of those experiments lines up with the development of Project Atlantis, a failed Game Boy successor that allegedly boasted a 32-bit ARM microprocessor half a decade before the Game Boy Advance. Rumors about Atlantis first sprung up in 1996, but besides 1 or 2 confirmations, it was basically all hearsay. That was until 2009's Game Developers Conference. At that year's GDC, Nintendo's Masato Kuwahara spoke about his time leading development on the DSi and showed off some prototypes. One of them was this. It was Atlantis. Kuwahara gave us photo evidence that it was real and existed circa 1995. Though, thanks to Okada, we know development started on it in 1994. So, those Atlantis rumors in 1996 got the name right, but what about that 32-bit ARM processor that they mentioned? And why was Atlantis scrapped? Over the years, people have speculated that it was too bulky or that it had poor battery life. And if Nintendo's PR is to be believed, it's because the Game Boy was doing great and they didn't want to cannibalize their own hardware sales. But we think we might have stumbled upon the real reason it was canned: money. And it has something to do with those 32-bit ARM processor rumors. In June 2019, the Talks at Google YouTube channel uploaded a discussion with Dave Jagger, a hardware designer who worked at ARM for over a decade starting in 1991. In the interview, Dave states that he was talking to and visiting Nintendo in 1994, a time frame that matches up with those magazine rumors. This was just after ARM unleashed ARM 7, which Dave actually led development on. The original ARM 700 was a 32-bit microprocessor that was benchmarking well, but it had a few issues that made it less than ideal for a handheld gaming system. The biggest problem relevant to games hardware was that it had poor code density. Let's explain. Initially, ARM 7 could only use the default ARM instruction set that's a 32-bit fixed-width instruction set. Every instruction then took up 32 bits, even simple instructions, leading to a fair amount of unoptimized and bloated code requiring a lot of storage space. This is problematic because if a game's total size grows to, say, 9 megabytes, and its data can't be cut or compressed any lower, instead of being published on an 8 megabyte cartridge, it would have to be put on a 16 meg cart. This is because computer storage grows most efficiently by doubling, going from 1 bit to 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. So if you're a company like Nintendo, and low-density code just bloated your game past the 8 meg mark, you now have to spend more money publishing it on a 16 megabyte cartridge. Since Nintendo was talking to Dave in 1994, it's clear they were interested in using an ARM processor in their hardware, and it gives merit to those Atlantis 32-bit ARM processor rumors from the 90s. We think this also makes it pretty clear that Atlantis was using ARM 7. And about 28 years ago, someone else thought so too. In Electronic Gaming Monthly's 83rd issue, one of their sources claimed that Atlantis used an ARM 710 processor. Next Generation magazine, on the other hand, claimed that Atlantis used a strong ARM SA110 processor, which came in 100, 160, and 200 MHz clock speeds. Even if Nintendo went with the weakest version of 100 MHz, that would have put Atlantis' CPU on par with the Nintendo 64's CPU. And frankly, a mid-90s gaming handheld rivaling the most powerful home console at the time sounds like, well, a load of old bollocks.
It seems like EGM's source was closer to the truth, but the ARM710 wouldn't have resolved the code density issue, and Nintendo needed a processor that wasn't going to balloon their games and push them onto bigger, more expensive cartridges.
While on a train in February 1994, Dave designed a 16-bit ARM architecture on a napkin based on the architecture in his college thesis. He realized that ARM could have two instruction sets, the 32-bit set ARM already used and a 16-bit set he named Thumb. Basically, Thumb's instructions are encoded into 16-bit as opposed to 32-bit, requiring half the bus width and occupying half the memory. And although some tasks would require more instructions to complete, overall, a program written in Thumb code took up just 70% of the space that it would in ARM code. This is exactly what Nintendo needed, as it meant games could be better optimized to fit on small ROM cartridges. And the first ARM CPU made that could use Thumb, the ARM7TD-MI, is what made its way into the final Game Boy Advance. Dave goes over some other interesting tidbits in the interview,
like how it's generally believed that Nokia commissioned development of the ARM7TD-MI, because the Nokia 6110 used it a few years before the GBA released, but it was actually made for Nintendo.
And that the NSA wanted to put a backdoor in the processor. Yeah, really. But that's about all Dave said. At least, that's about everything relevant to this video. So let's get back to that 64 Dream interview. The team wraps up their anecdotes about the Game Boy Color, bringing up how they were only given about a year to finalize its hardware. But even during this hectic time, and despite the failure of Atlantis, their minds wandered, contemplating a true successor to the Game Boy. Something more advanced. And the team would get their chance after work on the Color wrapped up. When designing the Game Boy Advance, one of the first details the team had to nail down was the screen size and aspect ratio. Kenichi Sugino says they could have just kept the screen the same size as the Game Boy Color, but that wouldn't have been impactful. They wanted the Game Boy Advance to have a sense of, it's gotten bigger, and it's changed. But this wasn't the only reason. The Game Boy got tons of home console ports over the years, but their visuals were heavily compressed, and even worse, they were all cropped to fit the incredibly square Game Boy display. The Advance screen had to be wider. The Game Boy Advance screen ended up being closer to the 4:3 aspect ratio of most TV screens at the time, but even more comparable to the 16:9 aspect ratio of increasingly popular widescreen TVs. The team experimented with different button layouts and screen positions, starting out with some long designs, similar to the OG Game Boy. But the designs all ended up being too ugly or too big, and the size made it difficult to reach the L and R buttons on the shoulders. The team tried to fix the issue by moving L and R down to the back of the device, and even considered completely ignoring button layouts from past handhelds and trying something new. But Game Boy games had to be playable on the Game Boy Advance, so the button positions had to be at least somewhat similar. The team realized they had to switch to a horizontal layout to keep the design neat and compact, which also left the Game Boy button layout intact. After tinkering with two Game Boy Advance prototypes that used a smaller and a larger screen, then making some optimizations that reduced cost and improved battery life, they finally let game developers take it for a spin. But developers had a problem with it. It was too low in memory.
And the team actually took the criticism on board.
Ryuji Umezu said, "In the end, what we made was a 2-chip composition with the CPU and a separate 2 megabit memory. That increased the cost, but also had a lot of advantageous side effects, like being able to download programs into the memory. This made it possible for 4-player modes using only one cartridge. It also allowed us to connect to the GameCube, download data, and run it. We kept coming up with more and more ideas like that." Interestingly, the GameCube had a small influence on the Game Boy Advance's design: its color. Sugino says the reason they made the main Game Boy Advance color violet was to tie it in with the cube. He goes on to say, "The GBA was displayed in silver at Space World because we didn't have the mold ready in time and had no choice but to paint over it to hide the surface treatment. We made over 40 different samples like red and yellow, but we really didn't want to use the same colors as previous Game Boys. With it being a new product, we wanted to release it in colors that hadn't been seen before. The GBA is a bit high-priced and higher tech than before, so we wanted to give it more of an adult colouring, and that's why one of the launch colours is Arctic White. Now, behind-the-scenes info about Nintendo hardware development is always fascinating, but it's about time we looked at some actual games. First, we're going to take a quick look at a Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga tidbit we've never heard before. It comes from the December 2003 issue of Japan's Nintendo Online magazine, which has an interview with a few Alpha Dream developers about their work on Superstar Saga. We had it translated, but unfortunately it was mostly old news, except for this one bit of info. In the game's final cutscene, Toadsworth and Lady Lima share a friendly embrace after basically not interacting with each other for the entire game. According to the game's scenario writer and lead field designer Hiroyuki Kubota, he wanted these characters' relations to go beyond friendship. Kubota said, "I like Lady Lima. She's got such a sharp tongue. If I had more leeway in development, I would have wanted to add in a romance between Lady Lima and Toadsworth. That could have been either very cute or very weird." Time to move on from Superstar Saga, but that's not the last of our Mario trivia. Another interview we had translated comes from the August 2001 issue of Nintendo Online magazine. This one's all about Mario Kart Super Circuit, the GBA's best-selling title outside of Pokemon Generation 3. The previous Mario Karts were both made in-house at Nintendo EAD, but Super Circuit's development would fall to longtime Nintendo partner Intelligent Systems. So this interview gathers Intelligent Systems' Takeshi Ando and Yukio Morimoto, who co-directed Super Circuit, as well as programmer Kenji Matsumoto and Nintendo's Hiroyuki Kimura, one of the guys who oversaw development and gave feedback. And these four divulge some pretty interesting details about how Super Circuit came to be. Hiroyuki Kimura kicks things off by saying that when the team first learned about the GBA's actual hardware, they thought about how the hardware might perform, and Mario Kart seemed like a good fit. Nintendo's past handhelds lacked the power to deliver a satisfying Mario Kart experience, but they could pull it off on GBA, and even have 4 players at once. When the team began testing their ideas, they started porting over Super Mario Kart from the SNES, and incorporated some elements from Mario Kart 64. Things developed quickly from here. Kenji Matsumoto mentions how time-consuming it was to make tracks early on, with the team barely scraping 3 courses together for Space World 2000. The game was first revealed here as Mario Kart Advance, a name Nintendo decided to keep for its Japanese release. But it seems scarcity turned into surplus, with Matsumoto saying that after Space World, "We created a tool that made things faster. We actually made a lot of other courses that didn't make it into the final product." Then Kimura chimes in, revealing something pretty interesting. At first we had courses under the sea as well, but Miyamoto said no to them. He said karts don't work underwater. Despite Miyamoto's initial resistance to underwater karting, the series would eventually embrace the idea a decade later in Mario Kart 7. To make the courses, Morimoto would draw them out on paper, then have a graphic designer create a test map. His designs were random at first and didn't factor in how the karts handled, but he got a feel for drawing more interesting curves that better fit the game as development went on. All in all, the game's tracks would be reworked 5 to 10 times to get them just right. Interestingly, Morimoto seems to say the team made the course graphics first, like backgrounds and floor tiles, then made the courses after. The team soon realized that a handheld Mario Kart would have some unique differences to its console cousins. While multiplayer in Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64 used split-screen multiplayer, on GBA, everyone would have their own screen. In Super and 64, you could see what items people had, resulting in, as Takeshi Ando puts it, pressure and bargaining amongst combatants. At one point, the team wanted to maintain this aspect of multiplayer, and even tried squeezing all 4 players' point of view onto the Game Boy Advance screen. The GBA's resolution is only 240 by 160 pixels, so each player's chunk of the screen would render gameplay with just 120 by 80 pixels. That's half as many pixels as an OG Game Boy game, which sounds horrible and is probably why the idea was dropped. They ultimately let each player enjoy their whole screen and flipped the script by letting players take advantage of what others couldn't see. The resulting lack of screen sniping and bargaining changed the balance of the game, so the team altered the appearance rate of items to compensate. Each player using their own GBA in multiplayer led to another issue, one that Matsumoto says was the hardest part of developing the game's multiplayer. Multiplayer was achieved in past Mario Kart games by plugging up to 4 controllers into a single console, meaning all the player inputs were sent to a single system. But if a multiplayer setup uses 2 or more handheld consoles, every participating device will receive user input, and all those inputs need to be synced up. The team struggled to get all the GBAs communicating with the right timing, and this struggle continued late into development. In fact, they were troubleshooting it all the way into the debugging stage. Despite this, the team decided to expand multiplayer further in late 2000 by adding support for the Mobile Adapter GB. This Japan-exclusive device would link the GBA to a cell phone and use the phone's wireless capabilities to play with others or even download new data for games. For example, Mario Kart players could download ghost data of the 10,000 fastest racers using the service. They were ranked on both national and regional leaderboards, where top players could earn titles like Kyoto Prefectural Champion. There were also ranked time trial contests and regular mobile GP tournaments held by Nintendo. These could have all kinds of custom rules that challenge players, like limiting the number of coins you can collect, maybe having only mushrooms appear for items, or even making it so players can only enter the tournament as Luigi. The interview ends with the team letting everyone know that a new tournament was underway titled Mario Kart Advanced GP 2001, and that the finals would take place at Space World 2001. Mario Kart games weren't originally intended to be played on a handheld, but the next series we're looking at was born on and refined for handheld. Let's dive back into the same issue of Nintendo Online Magazine for another interview we had translated. This one's for a game fans still hope will get a true sequel someday, Wario Land 4. The interview features such developers as the game's director Hirofumi Matsuoka, designer Takehiko Hosokawa, and programmer Goro Abe. Near the start of the interview, Matsuoka reveals that early on, the team decided Wario Land 4 should be designed for playing in short bursts, seemingly to capitalize on the GBA's portability. But some balance issues had to be addressed as well. Takehiko Hosokawa had played a key role in the development of every Wario Land up to this point. And while looking back at the series he helped create, Hosokawa realized the series had adopted what he believed to be a design flaw. With the exception of Wario Land 3's final boss, not a single enemy in Wario Land 2 or 3 can defeat Wario and trigger a game over. Enemies in those games just temporarily impede Wario's progress. It might seem like Wario's near godlike immortality would have few downsides, but Hosokawa came to see it as a huge disadvantage. Simply put, if Wario can't die, the game has no stakes and no real sense of urgency. So Hosokawa began thinking about how he could add that missing sense of urgency, and decided to tinker with Wario Land 3. He ended up adding a countdown to the game, which forced him to beat it within a time limit, and it worked. Hosokawa had found that missing sense of urgency, and the team decided to insert a time limit into every level of Wario Land 4. It's kind of funny, they ended up slapping a health bar on Wario in the final game anyway, but yeah. In early builds of the game, a countdown would be triggered as soon as Wario entered a level, and you'd have to collect treasure within the time limit. This would be expanded upon with the switch system in the final game. The team wanted to cram as many stages into the game as possible, but ended up having to reel in their expectations in order to hit deadlines. When development first started, the team looked at Wario's movement in Wario Land 2 and 3 on the Game Boy, and recreated it on GBA as a starting point. As work progressed, the team was surprised by how much detail they could squeeze into the GBA's graphics compared to Game Boy Color, and took every advantage of this while animating Wario. The team gave Wario almost twice as many frames of animation for his GBA debut than in Wario Land 3, letting them work far more character into his movements and mannerisms. In Wario Land 3, if you leave the game alone for long enough without pressing a button, Wario will kinda just fall asleep, or scratch his ass if you're on a ladder. But in Wario Land 4, he'll do things like pump dumbbells or jump rope. According to Hosokawa, these idle animations were never actually planned. The animators just threw them in for the fun of it. You can see the various quirks of the staff and the graphics they created, like the dumbbell and jump rope. Those weren't ordered by the director, but came from the staff drawing Wario, thinking that instead of standing still, it would be better if he was doing something, then putting that in. He also implies the game originally had even more animations and content that were cut, saying, "We made the game by packing in a ton of different elements and then shaving off what was unnecessary at the end." You can tell the team had a lot of fun making Wario Land 4. They even put themselves into the game's sound room, in full Wario cosplay and all. Matsuoka says this was to demonstrate as creators what's possible on the Advance. Another point brought up in the interview is that Wario Land 4's bosses all have, in the dev's own words, grotesque designs. This was apparently done because Wario is pretty popular in the United States, and the devs wanted to make the game seem more American. They even gave Wario an American-looking car. Goro Abe says this stateside cultural pivot was to change Wario's image. According to Abe, earlier games in the series gave the impression that they were just for dedicated fans. They saw this as an issue, and wanted to give Wario more mass appeal. A slightly Americanized Wario would be more relatable to Westerners, and Japanese people tend to see American things as kinda cool. On paper, it's a win-win. Another way they made the game feel more American was by regularly using audio samples of people talking and singing in English. That doesn't seem too strange today, but Hosokawa recalls there were some concerns that Wario Land 2 and 3 veterans might feel weird about the music, and this sentiment was echoed by Nintendo's own Mario Club playtesters when they were checking the game. But in the end, Wario Land 4's audacious soundtrack was well received. With the conversation winding down, the interviewer asks, what appeal does Wario have that Mario doesn't? Matsuoka reckons Wario's mischievous nature is something he has over Mario. He's rare for a Nintendo character, in that he's wild. Even the game manual is a bit questionable, but because it's Wario, it's okay. We don't recall Wario Land 4's manual saying anything too risque, so we checked the Japanese game manual. And yeah, it goes a bit harder than the North American and European booklets. Besides Wario's diary entry going into gross detail about his boogers and mentioning poop, the Japanese manual also has Wario saying he's gonna crap his pants from a fear of heights.
Did you know? Prior to working on the Golden Sun series, developer Camelot made several other RPGs. Most famously, they heavily impacted the Shining Force series. Camelot would go on to develop another RPG called Beyond the Beyond for the original PlayStation. While it was notable at the time for being the first traditional Japanese RPG available for the PS1 in the West, it was widely panned upon release. Reviewers criticized the game's length, pacing, difficulty, and overabundance of random encounters. Despite this, Beyond the Beyond was something of a spiritual predecessor to Golden Sun. Several features that made Golden Sun a rousing success, such as its combat and the pseudo 3D battle screens, made their first appearance in Beyond the Beyond. Golden Sun had a very long development cycle for a Game Boy Advance title, being in production for almost 18 months. By comparison, handheld games at the time were generally expected to be completed in under a year. The extended length of the project was mostly due to Golden Sun and its sequel, The Lost Age, originally being planned as one game. It was ultimately split into 2 installments because the combined size would have been too big for a single Game Boy Advance cartridge to hold. In order to justify splitting the story in half, The Lost Age was made to follow characters who were the antagonists in the first game, a concept the studio had utilized before. In an interview on Nintendo World Report, Hiroyuki Takahashi and his brother Shugo Takahashi stated, "Originally we had made a game called Shining Force 3, and it was popular here in the United States. In that game you had the ability to play as both good side and the bad side, and that seemed to be a really nice way for the players to understand the entire setting and a good way to convey information in the story. And so when we were doing Golden Sun, we again thought, well, we could expand upon that." Golden Sun's initial design documents outlined it as a Nintendo 64 game. Development started very late in the N64's life cycle, however, and the project was moved over to the Game Boy Advance. This actually helped the game in the end, as it released very early in the Game Boy Advance's life and became the first major RPG hit on the system. Conversely, the third game in the series, Dark Dawn, was released late in the DS's life, 7 years after the release of The Lost Age. The long wait for a sequel was a source of much frustration for fans, even prompting some to make hoaxes of a potential third installment. installment. The most circulated of these was called Golden Sun: The Solar Soothsayer. According to an online post, the Solar Soothsayer was a DS game announced at a small pre-E3 event complete with screenshots supposedly taken on a cell phone. The rumor ran rampant for some time, but the screenshots were eventually proven false as they reused promotional artwork for the Lost Age. The creator of the hoax, a forum user who went by the name Opium, later came forward and explained that he'd created the hoax to generate a discussion about a new Golden Sun game. While Hiroyuki Takahashi learned about the hoax during an interview with Engadget, he was enthusiastic about it, remarking, "The Solar Soothsayer sounds really cool. I wonder how the story would go. I want to see how it would turn out." Even though Dark Dawn took 7 years to come out, Camelot intended to work on a third Golden Sun shortly after The Lost Age. The project had to be put on hold as the team were busy working on the Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games. After this, several employees left Camelot, and the Takahashi brothers thought their new staff weren't ready to tackle development of such a large-scale game. In an interview posted on Camelot's Japanese website, Hiroyuki Takahashi said the idea to make a new Golden Sun game for the DS came to him after drinking a lot of liquor at a party. Since Dark Dawn was being made for the DS, the team naturally wanted to take advantage of the system's features and toyed with the idea of playing the game using only the touchscreen. Golden Sun featured a system that allowed players to carry over their save data into the Lost Age, either by way of a 260-character password or by using the Game Link cable. To many players' dismay, Dark Dawn didn't include any kind of data transfer system. According to Takahashi, they decided not to include it because Dark Dawn took place 30 years after the Lost Age, so there wouldn't have been much benefit to transferring the save data anyway. There are some interesting unused assets and secrets in the Golden Sun series. Hidden in the code for the first two games is an alternate character portrait for Alex. What's interesting is that the image is located in the same area reserved for the portraits of playable characters, suggesting Alex was intended to join the player's party at some point. There's also an unused NPC sprite for the character resembling Link from The Legend of Zelda in the data for the Lost Age. The sprite's intended purpose is unknown, but it's thought to be simply a nod to the Zelda franchise. When starting a new file in the original Golden Sun, the player will be given the option to change the name of Isaac, the main character. If the select button is pressed 3 times on the name input screen, the player will also be given the option to rename the other party members, Garrett, Ivan, and Mia. On Mia's name input screen, if the player presses up, down, left, right, up, right, down, left, up, then select, they can also change the names of Jenna, Felix, and Sheba. It's also possible to get a secret bad ending in the first game. Early on, the Great Healer will ask the player if they will accept responsibility for the fate of the land. If the player answers no and leaves the room, the screen will turn gray and a message will appear saying, "And so the world began drifting toward its fated destruction." The TV commercial for the first Golden Sun is famous for having absolutely nothing to do with the game. Dark Dawn referenced this by including the Chandelier Dragon from the commercial as a new summon. Camelot also referenced some of their older games. In the Lost Age, there's an injured shopkeeper behind the item shop in Madra. Casting Mind Read on her triggers the text, "Eyes, shining in the darkness. No, go away." Shining in the Darkness is the first title developed by Camelot and the first entry in the Shining Force series. Shining Force featured the character Dark Soul as the game's antagonist. In the Lost Age, the final boss, Doom Dragon, has an attack named Dark Soul Grasp. The future of Golden Sun is uncertain, and Hiroyuki Takahashi said that whether Camelot makes a fourth game depends on how much fan demand there is.
Did you know? Advance Wars is actually the 5th entry in a series generally referred to as Nintendo Wars. The first game in the series was Famicom Wars, followed by Game Boy Wars 1, 2, and 3, as well as Super Famicom Wars. A faster-paced Turbo edition of Game Boy Wars was also made with more levels, though this is largely considered the same game. Although the Wars series had stayed in Japan up to this point, Advance Wars was lucky to see a release in Japan at all. The game was one of several projects Nintendo made as part of their lineup of launch titles for the Game Boy Advance, but they were stretching themselves thin. In order to help alleviate their workload, Nintendo asked Intelligent Systems to aid with development of Advance Wars. At the time, the team was told that turn-based games weren't popular outside of Japan due to their complicated nature. Early on, members of Intelligent Systems would get together and discuss new ideas for the game, but these ideas were almost always shot down by Nintendo for being too sophisticated and unsuitable for a casual audience. In response, the team worked to make the title simpler and easier to understand. One way they did this was by adding a detailed tutorial so players wouldn't have to read the game manual before playing. Members of the team also incorporated elements from their own favorite game genres into Advance Wars. For example, the precision of movement when controlling units was inspired by shooter games, and rhythm games like Beat Mania helped to add a rhythm to the way the game is played. When Nintendo of America's marketing team got a chance to try Advance Wars, they loved it and decided the game was suitable for a full international release. The game received critical acclaim in North America and may have helped change Nintendo's view of the Western market. Kentaro Nishimura, one of the game's designers, cited the success of Advance Wars as a key reason why Nintendo eventually released Fire Emblem outside of Japan. Since the games had a similar playstyle, Nintendo thought the American Game Boy Advance audience had been primed for Fire Emblem. This seems fitting, as Fire Emblem only exists at all thanks to the original Famicom Wars, with the first Fire Emblem using the Famicom Wars engine. Advance Wars was launched in North America first, with releases planned for Japan and Europe shortly after. Ironically, despite originally being planned as a Japan-only title, Advance Wars actually ended up being cancelled in Japan. One explanation for this is that the game's original Japanese release date was October 12, 2001, just 1 month after the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States. An alternate theory is that the game was pushed back due to the release of Game Boy Wars 3, which came out in August of 2001. It's possible Nintendo didn't want their own games competing with each other and delayed Advance Wars to give Game Boy Wars 3 a fighting chance. Due to Advance Wars being cancelled, the game's sequel, Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising, was also cancelled in Japan despite both games being developed in the country. The games finally saw a Japanese release in the form of a 2-in-1 compilation cartridge in 2004, prior to the release of Advance Wars Dual Strike on the Nintendo DS. However, cancellations would continue to plague the series in Japan. The next installment, Advance Wars Days of Ruin, was released internationally in 2008, but was ultimately cancelled in Japan following a series of delays. Interestingly, the international versions of Days of Ruin contain a full Japanese translation in their data, though it's only available through hacking. This seems to indicate that the Japanese version of the game was fully completed and ready for release well before it was cancelled. Days of Ruin would eventually become available in Japan in 2013 as a downloadable title for members of the Club Nintendo Reward program. Although many Advance Wars titles released in Japan after the West, the Japanese game seems to serve as the base for all titles. After both versions of Advance Wars released, gamers saw several notable differences between the two versions. Most of the game's commanding officers had their names changed in the West, and some were even given redesigns. Nell was originally named Catherine and wore a sleeveless top with a shorter skirt. Drake was named Mop and seemed more like a traditional pirate. Sanja, originally called Asuka, wore glasses instead of a hat, and her uniform was changed from red to green. And Grit was called Billy and wore a cowboy hat. The most drastic changes were made to Olaf, who was originally named Whip and had a white beard and a Santa hat, and Kanbei, who was called Kikuchiyo and wore samurai armor in the Japanese game. Other differences from the Japanese version include the term Shogun being changed to Commanding Officer, and the Red Star Army being renamed to Orange Star. This subtle change in color was possibly to avoid direct comparisons to communist regimes. In Advance Wars 2, many of the visual changes to commanding officers were at least partially incorporated into the Japanese designs, leading to fewer differences between officers in both releases. In Japan, Advance Wars 1 and 2 are known as Game Boy Wars Advance 1 and 2. Although the Advance Wars name was kept for the DS games Dual Strike and Days of Ruin in the West, both titles adopted the leading title Famicom Wars DS in Japan. Days of Ruin had a notable tonal shift for the series, having a somewhat more realistic and gritty art style. According to one of the game's English localizers, Tim O'Leary, the change was made due to some fans saying the series was becoming repetitive and predictable. Interestingly, the shift was also influenced by sales data. Although it began as a Japan-only franchise, Advance Wars had become much more popular in North America than in Japan. As such, Intelligent Systems altered the game's tone in an attempt to cater to Westerners. Intelligent Systems also felt that the new style fit better with Days of Ruin's near-future sci-fi setting. There are several unique secrets and Easter eggs hidden in the Advance Wars series. In the first game's tutorial level, Copter Tactics, the player is instructed to win by capturing the enemy's headquarters. If the player instead wins by routing the enemy, it triggers an alternate dialogue from Nell where she congratulates the player for their work. Conversely, in the first tutorial level of Advance Wars 2, if the player somehow manages to run out of fuel, Nell will scold Andy for goofing around and tell him to forfeit the level. In the map editor mode of Advance Wars 2, if the player repeatedly attempts to place a unit on an illegal square at least 50 times in a row, it'll cause Nell to interject with a snarky comment, saying, "You must really like doing that over and over again. Keep it up." If the player holds down the L and R buttons while selecting the map editor, the game will load a special bonus map that spells out Nintendo in kanji. This same map appears in both Advance Wars 1 and 2. Dual Strike also includes a new bonus map featuring the name of the series itself, which was even translated for the English release. Another interesting fact about Advance Wars is that practically all of the weapons and vehicles in the game are based on real devices. For example, the Orange Star Mechanized Infantry is inspired by the American M20A1/A1B1 Super Bazooka, and the Blue Moon Mech unit is based on the Russian RPG-7 rocket launcher. The Orange Star fighter jets also resemble the American F-15 Eagle, while the Blue Moon jet seems to be based on the French Dassault Mirage 3. The original Advance Wars also contains a bizarre glitch involving the map editor. To trigger the glitch, the player must first play the level Naval Forces and lose by allowing the enemy to destroy their T-copter, then go to the map editor. By placing one unit and then deleting it, the game will respond as though the player's forces have been wiped out. If the player then exits the editor using the in-game menu rather than the map editor menu, the map editor's features will be available to use anywhere in the game. This glitch has several practical applications. First and foremost, it can be used to delete enemy units during a normal level, allowing the player to easily bypass any mission in the game. Additionally, the glitch can also be used to save the campaign maps as custom maps, which allows the player to use custom maps that are smaller than the default size of 30 by 20 tiles. The Wars series was also planned to appear on the Nintendo 64. In 1999, Nintendo announced a new entry in the series to be released for the Nintendo 64, dubbed 64 Wars or Advance Wars 64 by fans. The game was being developed by Hudson Soft rather than series creators Intelligent Systems. Hudson likely got this opportunity because of their work on Game Boy Wars Turbo and Game Boy Wars 2. Much like previous titles, the gameplay of 64 Wars would involve players controlling units on a 2D grid. However, the game would transition to 3D graphics to illustrate key moments in battle, as well as combat between units. 64 Wars was also going to feature connectivity with Game Boy Wars 2 via the Nintendo 64 Transfer Pack. According to promotional material, players could start playing a level on their Nintendo 64 and then transfer the game to their Game Boy to continue playing on the go. They could even transfer it back to the N64 to finish the level. Sadly, 64 Wars was a short-lived project and was only ever shown in a few magazine ads and previewed at Nintendo's Space World event in 1999. No reason was given for the game's cancellation, but Hudson did go on to make a third Game Boy Wars game. The series would eventually make it to the GameCube in the form of Battalion Wars 1 and 2. Although these entries have completely different gameplay and are considered a sub-series, they were originally announced under the title Advance Wars Under Fire and are known as Assault Famicom Wars Versus in Japan. The Advance Wars name was dropped in the West so that players didn't expect the game to play like a typical Wars game.
The Game Boy Advance brought us some amazing 2D titles, and impressively, even some 3D ones. The Advance truly pushed the portable gaming scene, though with the standard of today's portable systems, that may seem hard to believe for some of our younger viewers. As laughable as it may seem, the idea of having more than just a few colors on screen was pretty impressive at the time, even if they were hard to see thanks to the original Game Boy Advance lacking a backlight. Luckily, Nintendo recognized this fault and released the Game Boy Advance SP, which is still among one of their best portable devices to this day, taking up a ridiculously compact form factor and looking pretty damn spicy if we do say so ourselves. Of course, any good system needs good games, and the Game Boy Advance had them in droves. Many ports hit the system, like the Donkey Kong Country series, but new franchises also came along, like Golden Sun. And of course, Nintendo would release new entries for Mario, Metroid, and Pokemon. We'll start by going over Donkey Kong Country's releases, as Rare didn't just simply port the titles over, they actually gave them some new features. In Donkey Kong Country 3, Rare included a bunch of extra minigames as post-game content. What makes these minigames genuinely interesting, however, is that they're all based on an earlier and lesser-known Rare title for the NES titled Cobra Triangle. Cobra Triangle was a 1989 racing/vehicular combat game where players control a weapon-equipped speedboat through 25 levels, with various objectives such as winning races, saving swimmers, and defusing bombs. Cobra Triangle's music was notably created by David Wise, who also helmed the score for the Donkey Kong Country series. But of course, the original Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance also had some new touches. When the player enters Cranky's cabin, a few references to other Rare games can be seen scattered around as well. Mumbo Jumbo's mask from Banjo-Kazooie is sitting on a barrel in the foreground. Saber Wolf from the Game Boy Advance game of the same name has his head mounted on the wall, and a barely distinguishable picture on the wall is apparently the cast of Rare's Xbox title Grabbed by the Ghoulies, though it's probably safe to say that not many people really notice this one. Speaking of Rare, we recently talked about Banjo Pilot in our Every Cancelled Game Boy Advance Game video, and how the game was once Diddy Kong Pilot, but was heavily reworked after Rare was purchased by Microsoft. One thing we didn't mention in that video, however, was how an early build of the game actually featured a number of playable Mario characters. The characters in question were Mario, Peach, Yoshi, Wario, Bowser, and Toad, and they even had their own unique planes. Whether the initial plans included having these characters appear as playable characters is unknown, but it's very likely that Nintendo would have been reluctant to lend these characters for a third-party developed racing game when they are all prominently featured in Mario Kart. What's funny, however, is that considering the demo was Diddy Kong Pilot, the roster of this early build actually features more Mario characters than it does characters from the Donkey Kong franchise. So far, this video has been a bit Rare-centric, so let's take a quick detour to look at a game in the Mario, or rather, Wario series. Wario Land 4 was a pretty incredible game that pushed the Wario Land series onto more advanced hardware, and in doing so delivered more advanced audio. Vocals were actually used for the game's title track and ending sequence, something that wouldn't have been an option for handheld games before the Game Boy Advance released. Part of the vocals were actually taken from the first track of an audio sample compilation CD called 0G's Vocal XTC, which involved a variety of lines being sung by British session singer Helen Binding. One prominent line is,
"Your time is over, I've had enough, here I come, here I come, look out, here I come."
This line was cut up and used in the Wario Land 4 theme, of course with a bit of quality loss.
You wanna touch it down? Your time is over, I've had enough, here I come, look out, here I come.
This interesting tidbit was first documented on the Wario forums and didn't receive much attention from anywhere besides the Mario Wiki. Another title on the Game Boy Advance starring Mario seemed to many people as a bit of a strange game at the time of its release. Seemingly coming out of the blue, Mario Pinball Land sees the player take control of Mario as he lives his best life as a ball. Adrian Barrett and Richard Horrocks, two developers with a track record of having created several successful pinball games in the past, founded their own game development studio called Fuse Games, and after doing so, decided to try and pitch a new pinball game to Nintendo. But the duo knew they'd need something substantial to win Nintendo's favor, and decided to create a demo consisting of what they figured would be the first and last areas of the game. Afterwards, they traveled to Seattle to pitch the game to Nintendo of America, and despite the odds, this new upstart studio was allowed to work on a Mario game. They decided to develop the title for the Game Boy Advance rather than the GameCube, as Fuse Games' team had somewhat limited resources, and because of the system's similarities to more comfortable hardware for the developers, the SNES. Mario Pinball Land was the studio's first commercial project, taking 18 months to develop with a staff of just 5 people in total. Initially, the game was developed with the title Mario Pinball, but eventually the Land was added, likely to give the game's name a bit more flair and fit the naming convention of handheld Mario titles. Going back to another Rare-developed title, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge actually went through a number of changes during development, revealed from an early prototype version of the game. Of particular note, the developers shaved off 1/7 of the game's total notes and jiggies, reducing the total from 700 notes to 600 and 70 jiggies to 60. Paul Rame, a former programmer for the game, has spoken as well about how red feathers were removed from the game entirely, which would have given the player the ability to fly. He claims that the reason for their removal was because of numerous complaints about the feature, including the camera's deceiving perspective and some issues with scenery collision detection extending above the object on older maps, creating invisible walls and making movement extremely frustrating. Some characters were also set to be included but were cut from the final release, with a UFO-type character appearing in the game's prototype, which isn't found in the retail release. A character not just said to have movement graphics, but a dialogue icon, suggesting a more involved role than just an enemy. In the retail cartridge is a set of graphics which go unused as well, revealing that at some stage, Boggy, a recurring character in the series, was going to appear at some point. It's unknown why he was removed. While some games had lots of changes, others struggled to make any at all. For Metroid Fusion, spacefaring bounty hunter Samus Aran got a new look. Game director and writer Yoshio Sakamoto revealed in a 2003 interview that the first designers he handed the project to came back with the outrageous desire to change Samus's design. He stated, "It's been the same way for way too long, but changing the design of the hero of the game is a big deal, right? They were going to really need to convince us. Even though Samus's design from Super Smash Bros. Was popular, it was still no small thing to deliberately change her traditional Metroid design. That's why I told them that if they were going to change it, they'd need to introduce some new element, and a good justification for it. I told the team that deliberately changing Samus's design was nothing to take lightly. So, rather than have them thinking about simply changing her design, I tried to get them thinking about new gameplay elements they could introduce, and the necessity of having a solid reason in-game for doing so. This resulted in the creation of the Fusion suit, giving Samus a new blue edge. The suit is a stripped-down version of Samus's classic power suit, after the suit's organic parts bonded to her body, with the majority of it being surgically removed during the game's opening. Another title that was crafted with lots of love was the much-beloved JRPG Golden Sun. When it came to designing the world within the game, it's not all too surprising that the inspiration for landmasses came from the real world around us. When exploring the world of Wayard, you may have noticed that continents such as Gondwana bear a remarkably similar geography and culture to Africa. Even the name of Gondwana is likely a reference to the origins of the continent. Gondwana land, or Gondwana, was the ancient supercontinent that incorporated Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and the regions of India and the Arabian Peninsula. Other regions of Golden Sun's world reference locations in the real world too, with Angara being similar to Europe, as well as continental East Asia and the Near East. Indra has similarities to India. Oceania being similar to Oceania and Australia, Hesperia is inhabited by people resembling the North American Native Americans, Ateca takes on similarities to South America, and Tundaria is a frigid cold land not dissimilar to Antarctica. And while we're talking about beloved RPGs, let's jump over to a much talked about game, Pokemon Emerald. Although Emerald, and Generation 3 in general, have been talked about to death, the game still has a few secrets that aren't all that well known. One interesting tidbit is that the order that your rival, either Brendan or May, sends out their Pokemon during battle is entirely determined by which gender they are, and by extension is also determined by which gender the player chose for their own character before their adventure even started. However, for reasons unknown, this only works if the starter the rival chose was Trico, and doesn't come into effect if they chose Torchic or Mudkip.
Did you know? At the 2009 Game Developers Conference, Nintendo hardware designer Masato Kawahara showed off an unreleased successor to the Game Boy. This device was a precursor to the Game Boy Advance, and was codenamed Project Atlantis. The Atlantis name was chosen because the system was planned to release during the 1996 Olympics, which was taking place in Atlanta. This system had comparable specs to the Game Boy Advance, and would have been an incredibly powerful handheld for the time. British hardware designers Arm Holdings beings were contracted to create a power-saving ARM-710 CPU for Atlantis. This chip would have allegedly been so efficient that batteries could power Atlantis for up to 30 hours. However, the ARM CPU turned out to be inefficient for the device's needs, which caused performance issues. The device's internal components and form factor also led to its large size, which was ultimately the project's downfall. It was so huge that it couldn't fit inside the average pocket. While Nintendo were developing Atlantis, they allegedly made a game alongside the system titled Mario's Castle. Though nothing on this game exists publicly, and it's unknown if the title was transformed into another game. Nintendo went back to square one on their Game Boy successor, but this left them with a problem. It would take several years to develop a replacement for Atlantis, and the Game Boy was already nearly a decade old. Both gamers and developers were expecting Nintendo to release new hardware that was closer to the performance of rival handhelds. Nintendo decided to develop an updated Game Boy with a faster processor and color display that would satisfy these needs until a true Game Boy successor came to market. In August 1999, word leaked that Nintendo was working on a new handheld system known as the Advanced Game Boy, and just 1 month after the rumors first spread, Nintendo formally announced the Game Boy Advance. After going back to the drawing board, development of the Game Boy Advance took about 2 years. It also took Nintendo just over a year to decide which CPU the system would use. A system's CPU needs to be powerful enough to process the amount of information being displayed on screen. Because of this, Nintendo explored several different screen sizes while deciding on the Advance's CPU. According to designer Masahiko Ota, the team even considered making the Advance's screen vertical instead of horizontal. They also looked into making the device itself vertical like previous Game Boys. Nintendo wanted the system to be comparable to the Super Nintendo in terms of power for easy porting of games, but with some additions. Their desire to essentially make a handheld SNES can be seen in the Advance's early dev kits, which had SNES controllers wired onto their circuit boards. Nintendo also stated that cell phone connectivity would be a major focus for the new system. They claimed that by connecting a cell phone to the Game Boy Advance, players would be able to download and play multiplayer games, enter chat rooms, and read email, all on the Advance itself. In August 2000, Nintendo released more information about the Game Boy Advance, including its design, battery life, and price. Nintendo of America board member Peter Main announced the system would have some kind of modem, but no other information was given. By that time, developers had advanced development kits in their hands, and there wasn't a shred of any internet or network support for the system. The final look of the Game Boy Advance was made by French designer Gwenel Nicolas and his studio Curiosity Inc. This wasn't the only shape Nintendo experimented with, however. Even before the original Advance was finalized, Nintendo tested a clamshell design similar to the Game Boy Advance SP. The hardware team temporarily abandoned the clamshell, believing it to be too thick. One thing the team refused to abandon was backwards compatibility. Nintendo literally checked every single Game Boy and Game Boy Color game on the Advance to make sure it was fully backwards compatible. Hardware designer Ryuji Umezu said, "We're checking all of the previous Game Boy games for compatibility. There are a lot of titles, so that is pretty difficult. We have Nintendo employees along with part-time staff checking all of them." The Game Boy Advance was programmed to switch over to Game Boy Color mode when it detected the contents of a Game Boy or Color cartridge. However, Nintendo Research and Engineering General Manager Satoru Okada couldn't get this code to work. Okada then asked engineers to make a physical switch in the system's cartridge slot to change modes instead. The Game Boy Micro lacked this physical switch, and therefore lost the ability to play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games. The Game Boy Advance had instant and continued success, so much so that Nintendo released a redesigned system called the SP, which was an abbreviation for Special. Former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata wanted to include a sleep mode on the SP, but it couldn't be implemented within their timeframe. Having learned from his mistake, Iwata demanded a sleep mode be included in the Nintendo DS from the start. Nintendo also experimented with a touchscreen panel adapter for the SP, which would also be included as standard in the Nintendo DS. Nintendo even tried using 3D LCD tech with the SP, but they weren't happy with the results. The resolution was too small to produce a pleasing 3D image, and the processing power of the Advance struggled to render stereoscopic images. After the SP, Nintendo launched the Game Boy Micro, but this wasn't the last piece of Game Boy Advance hardware to be released. The Vistian dockable entertainment featuring Game Boy Advance was released in 2006 and was a DVD player that could play advanced games. The device was portable and meant for traveling in a car or other vehicle. Because of its specialized nature, the Vistian system couldn't be purchased at general retailers and was instead sold at car dealerships. Vistian was apparently interested in creating similar products using hardware from the DS and Wii, but neither of these projects came to fruition. Speaking of unusual Game Boy Advance hardware, there's an Advance add-on that was specifically made to help young people with diabetes. The Gluco Boy has 2 full video games and mini arcade stored on it. Whenever the user tests their blood levels with the Gluco Boy, they earn points that can be used to unlock games or purchase in-game items and features. The add-on was made after its creator, Paul Wessel, noticed his son wasn't testing his blood levels as often as he should be. Wessel decided that since his son loved playing his Game Boy Advance, he'd make something that incentivized the boy to check his blood levels more often. Similar to how the Super Game Boy allowed Game Boy games to be played on a TV through their SNES, the Wide Boy 64 allowed gamers to play advanced games on their TV through a Nintendo 64. These adapters were made for private use and allowed developers and publications to view games on a bigger screen. The Wide Boy 64 was developed by Intelligent Systems, who also created the Fire Emblem and Paper Mario series. However, the term Wide Boy is a generic name for adapters that allow Game Boy family games to be played through a console, and have been made for several Nintendo consoles. In fact, 2 other Wide Boy adapters were made for the Nintendo 64 specifically to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Much like the Super Game Boy, the Wide Boy 64 has almost all of the components of a Game Boy Advance inside it, besides the screen and buttons. Game Boy Advance games also came to other consoles via emulation through the Virtual Console. What's interesting about this is that the Game Boy Advance emulation on the Wii U wasn't even programmed by Nintendo. It was instead developed by the company M2, who are best known for their work on the eShop's 3D Classics series, as well as the Sega Ages series. This isn't the only Advance-related tech that wasn't developed by Nintendo. The technology in the system's Game Boy Advance video cartridges was actually developed by 4Kids Technology. These video cartridges were manufactured by Majesco Entertainment, with the exception of the Pokemon video cartridges, which were made by Nintendo. Using its established franchises, Nintendo made several tech demos to illustrate the Game Boy Advance's visuals, including a Zelda 2 and Yoshi's Story demo. However, other companies have used Nintendo characters as placeholders in their own tech demos. One of these demos is Mario Kart XXL by Daenerys Entertainment Software. The demo has Mario driving around a course with some interesting visuals. The purpose of the demo was to show how multiple background layers can be used to create the illusion of vertical depth. The result is something like having 2 of the SNES's Mode 7 layers rendering at the same time.
Did you know? There are 50 e-reader cards for Fire Red and Leaf Green that were never released outside Japan. A lot of the content the cards unlocked can't be accessed by any other means, and since e-reader cards are region-locked, most fans never got a chance to experience any of that content. Although it was eventually made compatible with other franchises like Mario and Animal Crossing, the e-reader was originally marketed as a Pokemon device called the Pokemon Card e-reader. Scanning the strips on select Pokemon TCG cards into the e-reader unlocked exclusive content for your Game Boy Advance, like a Space Invaders-style minigame where Tyranitar fights an active volcano. You could also scan e-reader cards into Ruby and Sapphire for trainer battles, unique berry types, and the Eon ticket that took you to the Southern Island. Most of the cards were released in the US, but due to the e-reader's lack of popularity outside Japan, functionality for the cards in international versions of Fire Red and Leaf Green were deactivated. As a result, this 50 card set remained exclusive to Japan, containing 37 trainer cards and 13 tower cards. Scanning a trainer card imports up to 3 trainers onto one floor of the trainer tower in the Sevi Islands, and the trainer tower is 8 stories tall, so you'd need to scan 8 trainer cards. Lots of these cards are themed, like shiny evolutions and Kanto starters. Each card shows you just a few of the trainer's Pokemon, and only a few of their attacks, so you won't know the rest until you battle them. Their Pokemon are all scaled to match the level of the strongest Pokemon on your own team, so they'll always be a worthy challenge. You can mix and match trainer cards to make any tower you want, but ideally, fans are encouraged to build towers curated by Game Freak themselves, which is where the tower cards come in. There are 13 different tower cards, cards, and each one is ranked by difficulty: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. A tower card tells you to scan 8 trainer cards in order to build the tower shown on the card. Tower cards also have an option for time attack, which gives players the option to have an extra layer of challenge for thrill seekers and completionists. Climbing towers doesn't reward you with experience, but you can win some decent prizes like dragon scales, metal coats, and upgrades. Some of these trainers were incorporated into international versions of the game without use of the e-reader, but a lot of them weren't, which makes these cards especially valuable to collectors. 44 cards in the game set could be found in 5 card booster packs, similar to TCG cards. One promo card was also distributed to fans in May 2004's issue of Koro Koro magazine, and the last 5 cards could only be acquired through Club Nintendo. Nowadays, these 5 Club Nintendo cards, 4 trainers and 1 advanced tower, are incredibly rare, costing upwards of $2,000. Due to the card's rarity and difficulty, Fire Red and Leaf Green's ultimate challenge is building the Club Nintendo Tower and completing its time attack of 12 minutes and 47 seconds. In Japan, the original Game Boy games were red and green, but internationally the first releases were called Pokemon Red and Blue. Since most international fans never played green, the remake's director, Junichi Masuda, admitted that Water Blue would have made more sense than Leaf Green, but decided against it to symbolize the harmony of the Pokemon world. In 2004, Masuda wrote, "If we follow the pattern of the original series, the new games would be Fire Red and Water Blue, but I chose green as a leaf as a symbol of peace. Fire and water are opposing concepts that suggest conflict, but the real world is already full of conflict, so we decided on names that suggest a peaceful world." Just like every previous game in the series, Fire Red and Leaf Green were localized into English almost entirely by just one man, a Canadian freelancer named Nob Ogasawara. As a thanks for his years of service, and also to provide an Easter egg for fans, Nintendo of America named lots of NPCs after him, starting with Black Belt Nob and Gen 2 Cianwood Jim, as well as another Black Belt on Hoenn Route 115. Nob told us that in real life he'd make a terrible Black Belt, as he has the coordination of a mechanical monkey. Nintendo later found out he spent a lot of his time off work hiking, so for Fire Red and Leaf Green, they changed Nob from a Black Belt into a hiker on his way to Bill's house. And you can find him on Route 25 with 3 Geodude and a Machop. Nob was also included in the remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. But after translating 25 Pokemon games almost single-handedly, Nob got laid off in the middle of Gen 4 due to contractual complications between Nintendo and the Pokemon Company, so unfortunately he didn't make his way into Sinnoh or any later iterations. Speaking of Nob Ogasawara, the Sevi Isles south of Kanto are based on the Ogasawara Islands that lie off the southern coast of the real-life Kanto region of Japan. They're actually named after Nob's ancestors, who claim to have been the first Japanese to ever set foot on these islands. The Ogasawara Islands were never geographically connected to the continent, and as a result, they're populated by plants and animals that are nowhere to be found on the Japanese mainland, which makes their in-game counterparts, the Sevi Islands, a perfect home for all of the Johto and Hoenn Pokemon found in Fire Red and Leaf Green. Some of the Sevi Islands represent specific Ogasawara Islands, like Deoxy's home, Birth Island, which is clearly modeled after Minami Torishima. In real life, the United States and Japanese governments fought over the strategic naval island for nearly 100 years. The US finally gained control of the island after World War II, but ultimately gave it back to Japan peacefully in the 1960s. There are over 30 Ogasawara Islands, and interestingly, the game's internal data shows a lot more Sevi Islands that didn't make it into the final game, including names and even some maps for Islands 8 and 9, as well as 22, 23, and 24. It appears Game Freak was originally planning on 24 islands, or possibly even more, but the internal maps are unfinished, so the islands count was probably reduced before too much time was spent in development. Some of the Sevis are also based on the Izu Islands, a volcanic island chain that inspired Mount Ember, the dormant volcano on one island, and also Naval Rock, whose winding passageways were formed by volcanic lava. In addition to the extra islands, another aspect of the Sevis never saw the light of day, and as a result, Fire Red and Leaf Green ended up with only 46 Johto Pokemon instead of the 59 Game Freak intended. Surfing north of 6 Island, players can find a small area called Outcast Island, whose only purpose is being home to Altern Cave. It's a small cavern about 4 screens large, and it only contains one Pokemon, Zubat. At first glance, it seems like a pointless local, but it's actually left over from a series of unused events. These events would have given fans a mystery gift that altered the Pokemon found inside, replacing Zubat with 8 Johto Pokemon: Mareep, Aipom, Pineco, Shuckle, Teddy Ursa, Houndour, Stantler, and Smeargle. Fans would have been met with the following text, which can still be found in the game's data. "Thank you for using the mystery gift system. Recently, there have been rumors of rare Pokemon appearances. The rumors are about Altern Cave on Outcast Island. Why not visit there and check out if the rumors rumors are indeed true. But unfortunately, Nintendo never got around to actually hosting any of these events, so these Gen 2 Pokemon and their evolutions, a total of 13 monsters, ended up unobtainable, and nowhere to be found in Ruby and Sapphire either. So fans were left with some annoying holes in their Pokedex that couldn't be filled until Emerald hit store shelves a year later. When Fire Red and Leaf Green launched, art director Ken Sugimori drafted a new art set to replace the series' original watercolor art, and in the process changed the number of fingers and toes on a lot of Kanto Pokemon. Haunter, Golem, and Raticate all had 4 fingers on each hand, but their updated designs had just 3. Meanwhile, Pikachu and Mr. Mime sprouted additional fingers, now giving them 5 on each hand. According to PokeBeach founder John Zahagian, at a 2009 Tokyo event, a Pokemon Company staffer told him, "The Pokemon Company has an internal list of every change ever made to a Pokemon's design. For example, he told me Mr. Mime gained an extra finger because Japanese parents wrote in to complain about its 4 fingers being associated with gangs. I later learned the Yakuza get their fingers cut off, so I guess parents thought Mr. Mime was a Yakuza reference." There's a taboo in Japan against cartoon characters with 4 fingers, not only because of the Yakuza, but also because it's considered offensive to lower class workers like butchers and meat packers who've lost a finger. Some Pokemon also sprouted extra toes, like how Zapdos and Dodrio went from 3 on each foot in Gen 1 to 4 on each foot in Fire Red and Leaf Green. But this probably had more to do with consistency than taboo. Articuno, Moltres, and Doduo had all 4 toes from the very beginning, so the designers probably thought it was weird that Zapdos and Dodrio only had 3, and revised their designs accordingly. All these Pokemon's original designs were never seen again, and future generations permanently replaced them with Fire Red and Leaf Green redesigns. According to Satoru Okada, the general manager from the DS games, the DS might not have had built-in Wi-Fi if it wasn't for Fire Red and Leaf Green. As you can still see on the game's box art, fans who bought Fire Red and Leaf Green also received a GBA wireless adapter, which allowed for trading in battles without a link cable. In an interview with Japanese Nintendo Online magazine, Okada said, "We started development with a wireless adapter bundled with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. When we saw it, we thought we can definitely make it happen. Some people find the cable annoying, and you can't really walk around or move when connected to another system. So we wanted to develop the wireless capability even further. We thought making it part of the system itself, rather than an adapter, would make it even easier to use. If Okada's team hadn't built Wi-Fi into the DS, many of the special events in Gen 4 and Gen 5 wouldn't have been possible."
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today we're taking a look at trivia for several Game Boy Advance games. The GBA was a tyrant in the gaming market after its release, and one of our favourite handheld devices. It's easy for younger gamers to overlook the improvements the device had over its predecessor, but it gave us access to portable games that matched the quality of titles seen only on home consoles just a few years earlier. Nintendo's crafty little machine brought several highly produced and high-profile games that, despite being on a small scale, continue to have a big impact on those that played them. As a series that was always at home on Nintendo handhelds, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire was perfect for demonstrating how the system could expand on an already pocket-sized adventure. As with each new Pokemon iteration, the amount of lovable creatures the player can collect was greatly expanded. While many are now fully aware of the lineup introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, they weren't always set in stone, even after the game had entered full development. In 2020, an early beta for the game was leaked online in what became known as the Giga Leak. By exploring the data of this early version of the game, several unused Pokemon were revealed, though without any graphical data, only descriptions. Pokemon number 298, which in the final release was Azurill, was originally planned as a grass-type shrub Pokemon with a sprinkler motif. Did You Know Gaming's own Dr. Lava commissioned an artist's interpretation by Rachel Briggs based on the descriptions revealed in the leak. The creature's Ruby Pokedex entry reads, "It collects a large amount of water inside its body and sprays it out like a shower while rotating. It is convenient to have around on hot summer days." And the Sapphire description reads, "It drinks over 100 litres of water a day. When the water it has collected in its body gets low, the leaves on both its hands wither." Another Pokemon of interest is Rayquaza, which actually looked somewhat different during development. Initially, the creature would have been white, scaly, had a beak, and would have measured up to only half the size of what Rayquaza would ultimately be. This image was also commissioned by Dr. Lava and drawn by Rachel Briggs. Many Pokemonsters may be cute and small, but what could be any cuter than the lovable Crescitini, Hamtaro? Hamtaro Ham Ham Heartbreak not only appeared on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, but even referenced the Big N's own Legend of Zelda franchise. In the cove located in Sunny Peak, the player comes across the slightly overused trope of a sword stuck in a pedestal. In order to pull the sword, the player must first locate a red, blue, and green marble to place within the pedestal, in reference to Ocarina of Time, where Link must perform a similar act to unleash the Master Sword. This reference is backed further by the music that plays once the sword is drawn. Combining both small stature and Zelda together, you'll inevitably land upon the Minish cap. Meredith Lord from over at Zelda Universe put together some interesting information that perhaps people might overlook from the Minish cap, particularly surrounding the Hylian language and how it is used throughout the game's library area. Perusing the tomes on the second floor, where the player comes across Sturgeon from Wind Waker, it's possible to read the Hylian language on the spines of the books. This language shares its formatting with that of the Wind Waker, which corresponds to Japanese kana. Many of these books' titles simply translate to predictable titles like Ancient Civilizations and A Flower Encyclopedia. That said, one book actually translates to Bucket and Hose. Now, this is a pretty weird name for a book, but it isn't the result of poor translation, but rather a reference. In Wind Waker, the fisherman refers to the Triforce as the Triumph Forks, which in Japanese can also be translated to Bucket and Hose, a play on the name for the Golden Relic. We know all too well that references are all over the place in games, and although they may mostly give a nod to other media, some reference real life and are significantly harder to uncover. With Star Wars Flight of the Falcon, it's possible to unearth more about the people behind the game with an extremely bizarre and out-of-place method. Entering a cheat code by pausing the game, holding L and R and pressing up, right, A, start, A, down, A, start, start, spelling out, "You are a sad ass," the game will automatically unpause. After this, if the player quits back to the game's main menu, goes to the password screen and uses the code F4CE, Leetspeak for face, a new hidden menu will appear revealing a series of portraits of the developers at Pocket Studios. Another game release for the GBA actually does something similar, though in a more difficult to approach fashion. While Star Wars incorporated a full menu for hidden photographs to be found, Spirits and Spells takes a more obfuscated approach. Within the game's data are some standard JPEG format images which can be unearthed, though there is no code to display them in-game. 4 photographs can be found, with one of the subjects seen across the images believed to be Clement Cord, an in-house programmer for Magic Pocket, the game's developer. This is based on the first image having katakana for Kuremon, a possible take on the name Clement. These images actually have quite a bit of exposure, not just appearing in Spirits and Spells, but the first 2 images can be found in the data of both Road Rash Jailbreak and Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance as well. Sometimes references to the real world aren't so much the real world, but a digital world, the realm of the internet. Before the internet, as many of you know it now, people would communicate through user groups, a sort of proto-message board. These days, popular content goes viral through social media, but back in the old days, it used to be spread around on forums or through email chains. It was a simpler time that, if you experienced being pulled into an email chain, you probably wouldn't miss. That said, some bizarre elements from this time continue to have a presence years later. With The Hobbit for the Game Boy Advance, it's clear that the devs over at Sapphire enjoyed one story that made waves across the internet, a story about monkeys. The story can be found within the data for the game, inaccessible through normal gameplay means. The reason we know that Team Sapphire enjoyed this story in particular is because it also appears on another GBA game they developed, Hot Wheels Velocity X. The story is 500 words long, so we'll briefly summarize it to save time, or you can pause the screen if you want to read the whole thing. Essentially, the writer likes monkeys so much that he bought 200 for 5 cents a piece from a pet store. He then explains his ventures in handling such vast quantities of monkeys, and how one might think that purchasing so many monkeys may have been a fun experience, but it isn't all it was cracked up to be. That said, it can provide unexpected returns and teach you how to handle unfortunate situations. When it comes to video game censorship, most titles that end up getting censored are those being localized into English from Japanese, and the censorship is almost always to remove lewd or risque imagery. However, with Yggdra Union, the opposite is true, with a rather revealing bath scene having more on display in the NTSC release than its Japanese counterpart. The image is covered with additional foliage in the game's Japanese release, not present in the US version. This also remains true for the later PSP version, though the Japanese version has been altered so that rather than foliage, Yggdra can be seen draped in a cloth, also not present in the US version. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. We thought we'd take a look at a game that surprised quite a few. Ubisoft decided that Just Dance 2020 would not release just on modern platforms, but also the Nintendo Wii, a console that was not just out of production, but which hadn't seen a new game since Just Dance 2019. And before that, Just Dance 2018. The reason behind the game's choice to release on a system which is no longer supported by its manufacturer was assumed by many on social media to be the result of the game's position as a physiotherapy tool for patients with limited mobility in hospitals. Polygon spoke with Ubisoft to confirm the game's release, with one representative stating, "It would be inaccurate to say that Just Dance is available on the Wii solely because it's developed for physical therapy purposes. Just Dance 2020 is coming to the Wii because our audience wants it." It was reasoned that the publisher chose to release the game for the Wii because of the system's wide availability, and because much of the title's audience are either families or children who continue to play the Wii. Ubisoft has been known to donate consoles to children's hospitals along with copies of Just Dance, so it isn't too surprising that the company is willing to meet demands from their main audience on Wii. But it does also lend itself to keeping their earlier donation of Wii consoles current.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this episode we're going to be looking at some trivia from titles released on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance. Nintendo's grip on the portable gaming world has always been strong. It's perhaps one of their most revered ventures by fans and critics. After the Game Boy and Game Boy Color came the Game Boy Advance, a portable with very little competition in the West, with specs comparable to that of the Super Nintendo. The best-selling trio of games on the system were Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald versions, which saw several revisions and were even remade on the 3DS. Games are usually tweaked and reprinted shortly after they're released, as a large audience of players encounter bugs that the comparatively small development team never found. These revised builds usually have a number that indicates their version, such as version 1.1, 1.2, etc. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire's version 1.1 release had several changes, but not all of these changes fixed bugs. Humorously, the English localizers happened to misspell the names of multiple Pokemon in the original release, which were fixed in 1.1. The item description for the Togepi doll misspelt its name as Topgepi, and Mawile's Pokedex entry in Ruby spelt his name as Mahwile.
You're saying it weird. Why are you putting so much emphasis on the H?
Speaking of differences, Pokemon Emerald version had several pieces of exclusive content, including the elusive Mirage Tower. This tower, or at the very least its English name, may be a reference to a tower with the same name from Final Fantasy. Both Mirage Towers appear in a desert, and only appear under certain circumstances. They both also contain a spiral-shaped dungeon within them. Some other GBA games were considered hits even though they didn't sell nearly as much as Pokemon. The best-selling game on the system that didn't have Pokemon in its name was Mario Kart Super Circuit, which had a rather extensive amount of unused content. The game has all 4 of Super Mario Kart's battle stages within its data, completely unused. Since tracks from Super Mario Kart can be unlocked for regular kart races, it's speculated that these battle tracks were planned to be unlockable at some point during development. The game also has several unused items, some of which have some functionality when hacked back into the game. There's an unused fake item box which places a banana behind the cart. There's also a gold mushroom which has the same functionality as in later Mario Kart games, and an infinite mushroom which never runs out of boosts. There are triple bananas as well, but these have no programming attached to them. A bomb icon also exists in the game's data, but it's unclear whether these would have been items like in Mario Kart Double Dash, or if they'd represent the player as a bomb in battle mode like in Mario Kart 64. Hidden content can be found in other GBA games as well, such as in the data of F1 2002. Looking through the data, a number of standard JPEG format images can be unearthed in both the NTSC and PAL releases of the title. These files are mostly made up of photographs, though one of them shows a CG dinosaur. It's possible that these were included by the game's developers to use up excess storage space on the cartridge. In the Japanese version of Mario & Luigi's Superstar Saga, Boomerang Bros can drop an item called Oho Gear once they're defeated. This item raises the player's defense by 28 points and can be equipped by either Mario or Luigi. For unknown reasons, it was removed from all international ports of the game. The item can still be found in the game's data in the English game, however, and can be used through hacking or cheat devices. The item is fully functional in all versions, and its description was translated into multiple languages. This seems to indicate that the Oho Gear was originally meant to be in the game's international releases, but was disabled late in its development. The reason for this remains unknown. Developers sometimes want to incorporate their history into a game, as can be seen with Maya the Bee: The Great Adventure. Normally, booting the game will run through the developer's credits, such as the Shinen logo. By holding both of the system's shoulder buttons during this sequence, the Shinen logo will actually change to Abyss instead, and the game's credits will instead use the developer's pseudonyms. This is because the company Shinen is actually made up of members from the demo group Abyss, a prominent team from the demo scene during the days of the Amiga. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories saw the series' first venture onto Nintendo hardware, but it initially had a different name. Tetsuya Nomura stated in the Kingdom Hearts Ultimania book for the title that the game was originally called Kingdom Hearts Lost Memories. This seems fitting for a game about Sora trying to recover his memories of the past events from the first entry in the series. It would have also been fitting to have Deep Jungle, the Tarzan-themed world from the first game, make a reappearance, though it does not. The reason for Deep Jungle's omission from the title was due to copyright. Both Square Enix and Disney were unable to get the rights to use the franchise's concept and characters from the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Another game which struggled from copyright issues was its Mr. Pants. Many will be unaware of Mr. Pants' history, being a joke mascot created by Rare staff member Lee Loveday with MS Paint. He was fleshed out after becoming popular with fans of the company, before he finally made his video game debut on the Game Boy Advance in 2004. However, this game wasn't always intended to be a Mr. Pants game, and was initially a Donkey Kong title called Coconut Crackers, featuring Donkey Kong characters, locations, and items. Before landing on Coconut Crackers, they even considered calling the game Splodge, Nutcracker, Animal Crackers, and Sunflower. During development, the game could have been played in both 2D and 3D, a feature removed due to issues with the consistency across both views. Eventually, the Donkey Kong license was dropped due to Microsoft's acquisition of Rare in 2002, before THQ picked up the title and replaced Donkey Kong with Mr. Pants and his family. To keep the game's graphics true to its childish art style origins, the game's artist would create graphics using their less dominant hand. Its Mr. Pants was also planned for release, alongside other Microsoft titles, for the Gizmondo handheld, though it was later cancelled due to the Gizmondo being a commercial failure. Speaking of undergarments, Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure has a couple of interesting localization differences between the European and American releases. When Shenron offers Pilaf any wish, Oolong will barge in and ask for some girls' panties. However, the American version has Oolong demanding, "Give me the world's most comfortable underwear." The underwear was also altered to look more masculine in the American game. The American version has a spelling mistake as well. In the level Land of Corinne, after catching him 10 times over, Corinne will say that Goku's power has increased several times over. Mega Man Battle Network took the Mega Man series to the Game Boy Advance with its own new spin-off series of RPG titles, and makes reference to Pokemon. In Yai's house, a yellow rug can be found in her living room, similar in appearance to a skinned Pikachu from Pokemon. Also in the game, outside the Dentown movie theater, is a movie poster for Upgrade Impossible 3, featuring Rom Cruise, a clear parody of the movie Mission Impossible 3 and its lead actor Tom Cruise. Another popular RPG on the Game Boy Advance was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. In the game's introduction, the player encounters 3 schoolyard bullies, Guinness, Colin, and Lyle. After the battle, the player is warped to the magical world of Ivalice. Morbidly, much later in the game, a mission will become available which involves saving a professor from 3 zombies, each with the same names as these children. Harvest Moon, more Friends of Mineral Town, has a bizarre Easter egg based around fan speculation. If the player goes to sleep at 9 PM on the 30th day of winter, there is a chance they will be shown a dream sequence featuring both the female playable character and the mayor of the town, Mayor Thomas. The two will appear to be getting married, only for the player to wake up confused. So confused, in fact, that she will even forget how the word dream is spelled, an obvious mistake by the developers. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. In this episode, we'll be looking at Gex, released in 1994. Justin Knorr worked on the title as lead designer, but during development, a lot of content that Justin wanted to include ended up being cut. After returning to work on the game after a weekend off work, he found that somebody had modified one of the levels he had designed without his permission. Greg Tavares recalled what happened next. This editing of his level was the final straw, and so we went into his office and did a big no-no. A few days later, his edits were discovered by playtest. They had programmed the ability to include messages in the game, as well as a level select screen with over 80 levels to choose from, despite the fact there were only 28 in the game. In one of Justin's levels he designed for the Kung Fu world, he wrote a message providing the cheat code for this level select, telling the player to check out a certain level. This level was his original design for the same Kung Fu stage, but with some elements that were removed in the final release. Greg Tavares paraphrased what was written on his blog. "Didn't you think this level had some cool shit in it? This level was cut because the company didn't put you, the customer, first, but just wanted to make money. Call Madeline Canepa at 415-555-1212 and give her a piece of your mind and my mind too." It included the real phone number for Madeline Canepa, head of product development on the title. Playtesters found the message, and after it came to light, Justin Knorr was fired immediately for not just personally upsetting members of the team, but also threatening Crystal Dynamics' relationship with Panasonic, the game's publisher.
Did you know? Mother 3 was conceived during a stressful period before Earthbound's launch. Series creator Shigesato Itoi believed that most RPGs were structured like road trip movies, and wanted to switch up the formula and set a game in a single town that changes over time. Itoi's first idea for a protagonist was a detective who'd solve crimes while living above a supermarket. The character would attempt to solve a murder, but could only progress by building relationships with the townspeople. Because of this, Itoi prized minor details. For example, a woman hanging out washing would be seen wearing clean clothes the next day. Shigeru Miyamoto compared the concept to that of Majora's Mask, which used a similar mechanic. Satoru Owada, producer of the Mother 3 project, hinted that Itoi's pitch may have influenced Animal Crossing, which he described as the realization of Itoi's idea. Mother 3 was originally planned for the Super Nintendo but soon changed course, becoming a 3D Nintendo 64 disk drive game. Several screenshots from this time featured a playable character who looked like Ness, the protagonist of Earthbound, suggesting the game was to have stronger ties with the rest of the Mother series. The rewritable nature of the 64DD software led Miyamoto to consider letting players transfer their art from the Japan-only Mario artist into Mother 3. Itoi immediately shot this idea down, as he didn't want to include features just to show off the console's capabilities. After the commercial failure of the 64DD, the game changed course again, aiming for release on the Nintendo 64. Due to the Earthbound team's inexperience with 3D technology, a brand new team was brought in to develop Mother 3. But this team was unfamiliar with the series, and Owada would often have to give them advice on how to construct gameplay scenarios. Things were made even more difficult by Owada's absence during development, as he had other commitments in America and Kyoto. The scope of the game was also too large for the team due to the complex interplay between the world and the characters. Some elements were unfeasible with the Nintendo 64's hardware, but the team stubbornly pursued them, inspired by Owada's words of encouragement. Never say a programmer can't do something. After 3 console changes and 6 years in development, Mother 3 was cancelled in August of 2000. In an interview with Itoi, Miyamoto and Owada estimated the game was anywhere between 30 to 60% complete when it was cancelled. It was in this same interview that Itoi mentioned the possibility of restarting the project on the Game Boy Advance. Producers discouraged him, saying it would be just as much work to make a GBA game as an N64 game. Nevertheless, the project was restarted in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance. A compilation game called Mother 1+2 was also released as a refresher for the franchise, and a commercial for the game ended with the message confirming Mother 3 was back in development. Itoi did not regret downsizing the game. He felt the final product reflected his vision and was happy they didn't go with the 3D look, as pixel art went hand in hand with the series. Wood and metal were meshed together in Mother 3's logo to reflect the game's themes of inclusiveness. Another reason was to create an uneasy juxtaposition between the natural world and the modern world, a key theme in the game. It would also reflect the game's chimera enemies, which are separate creatures combined into one. A toy compared these creatures to Sid's toys in Toy Story, who were spliced together from different parts. In fact, while the game was in development for the 64DD, a toy considered using Chimera Forest as a subtitle. This was not used in the final release, as the team didn't want to influence how players imagined the world before they played the game. The Magypsy character was created in response to what a toy referred to as the more macho story in Mother 3, which is focused on conflict. The Magypsies, who find themselves in the middle of the conflict, are androgynous and have accepted that they will eventually die. By blending masculine and feminine traits and a refusal of power, the Magypsies balance out the more masculine nature of the story. The Magypsies fit perfectly with the toy's perception of Mother as a more feminine RPG franchise. When one of the Magypsies begins to disappear, they say a phrase which roughly translates to, "I'm disappearing for a bit. I'm okay though." This is a reference to the official slogan a toy wrote for the 1989 film Kiki's Delivery Service, which roughly translates to, "I was depressed for a while. I'm okay now." The team joked that they would have refused the reference were it not written by a toy himself. The character Duster also has interesting inspirations and was given a limp because of the game's theme of inclusivity. A toy reasoned that handicapped people should be as much a part of the world of Mother 3 as they are a part of ours. In Mother 3, the player saves by talking to save frogs, in contrast with past games in the series where players called their father. This was a decision made with some hesitance, as the team were worried that fans wouldn't like the change. Frogs were specifically chosen because of their peculiar nature. The toy thought that an animal like a dog wouldn't stand out enough to seem important. The decision was also influenced by the song Furimakeba Kaeru, which translates roughly to, "If you turn around, frog." The song was written by a toy and performed by the Japanese pop singer Akiko Yano. The lyrics portray an optimistic frog who, in spite of its own trivial nature, encourages people not to be dejected by their failure. In a similar vein, the game's save frogs are seen after the player dies. There's an incognito Mr. Saturn in the game who, after bidding the player farewell, is revealed to have walked just slightly off screen. This was originally just a bug, but was kept in the game as the toy found it funny. The area Tane Tane Island was also inspired by American TV series like Lost and Twin Peaks. However, these areas had to be toned down because the toy was made so uneasy by his initial draft. Mother 3's soundtrack was composed by Shogo Sakai after the composers of the first two games were unavailable due to other commitments. The length of Mother 3's soundtrack, which is comprised of 250 songs across 6 hours of music, needed a composer who could devote their full attention to the project. The composer was also required to be familiar with the game and its themes. Sakai was an obvious choice due to his enthusiasm for the material. The game's main theme, called the Love Theme, was composed very late in development, and didn't even exist in December 2005, 4 months before the game's release. The Pigmask Army's theme was to be used in its place up until that point. The team decided that a new theme should be composed because of an unspecified scene of extreme importance, which required a greater emotional impact than the planned composition could provide. 8 Melodies from Earthbound Beginnings became a popular song in Japan, even appearing in elementary school textbooks. As a result, a toy imagined a beginner being able to easily play Mother 3's Love Theme on piano. To achieve this, he specified that the theme should be easy to both hum and play on piano using only a single finger. Sakai was evidently prepared for such an order, as despite the late request and a toy's stipulation, he was able to produce the Love Theme almost immediately. The sample that plays during both of the game's name selection screens is actually taken from a toy himself. It was recorded without his knowledge by Earthbound composer Hirokazu Tanaka. According to a toy, Tanaka tricked him into saying the phrase, and recorded it with a hidden tape recorder. There are many nods and references to other compositions in Mother 3's soundtrack. The music that plays during Leader's story is called Leader's Gymnopede. The song is not an original composition, but is actually an adaptation of Gymnopede No. 1 by Eric Satie. Additionally, the song Ode to Ancestors, 8th Movement, is a medley of classical musical pieces, including pieces from Beethoven, Bach, and George Frederick Handel. The intro to Mr. Batty Twist is a reference to the iconic theme music from the 1960s Batman television series. 16 Melodies, as the name suggests, contains the melodies from both renditions of 8 melodies from Earthbound Beginnings and Earthbound, respectively. The love theme from Mother 3 is also incorporated into the song. Various themes in the game also include the distinctive sliding synth sample featured in Earthbound. And while not a composition, the enemy called Gently Weeping Guitar continues the Mother series' tradition of Beatles references, this time to their song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. As expected from its long development cycle, content was cut from Mother 3. It seems that the player was planned to fight the Green Dragos at some point during the game. In the fight, the Drago refuses to attack the player, instead confiding in you and making you cry. This may suggest that the battle was to have a tragic tone, with the player being forced to fight the Drago against both of their wills. It seems that this battle was also related to the frozen Drago in the Chimera Lab, as the Drago drops the Chimera Lab map once defeated. Many of the bosses have unused battle sprites showing them from behind. In the final game, bosses cannot be approached from behind, meaning that it's impossible to see these sprites. There are also unused animations for the Masked Man, showing him exploding, levitating, firing his arm cannon, and being repaired. Although the Mother series has a cult following in the West, Mother 3 has yet to be officially released outside of Japan. It was, however, unofficially translated by Clyde Tomato Mandolin, a professional games translator who has unofficially translated many Japan-only games such as Bahamut Lagoon and Star Ocean. The translation quickly passed 100,000 downloads upon its release, and Mandolin stresses the translation was done out of love rather than to compete with Nintendo. Despite its lack of a Western release, the game was re-released on the Japanese Virtual Console in December of 2015. Rumors arose in February 2016 that the Virtual Console port of Mother 3 would finally be released to Western audiences. The rumors surfaced in the wake of both the Japanese port of Mother 3 and the release of Earthbound Beginnings in 2015, 26 years after the game's release on the Famicom. It has to be noted, however, that while Earthbound Beginnings ROM was completed but never released, no official translation effort has ever been known to exist for Mother 3. As a result, porting Mother 3 to a Western platform would take significantly more work than Earthbound Beginnings did. Shigesato Itoi has denied rumors that Mother 4 is in development. Itoi was inspired to create the series by his young daughter, whom he was unable to see as often as he would have liked due to divorce issues. Now that his daughter is grown up, he feels no more reason to continue creating Mother games. Itoi also compared his experience to that of a pop star who, as a professional, is forced to keep making albums even if they've run out of ideas. Itoi said he was relieved making games was not his job. If it were, he would have to keep making sequels for more cynical reasons. Itoi comically said, "Doing things like that for fun has ended for me. If I were to try to do it now, it would be something I'd had to force. That would be awful for my sphincter."
Did you know? Donkey Kong wasn't even supposed to be in DK King of Swing, or that WarioWare is basically a sequel to 1 minute of a 64DD game, or how Fire Emblem fangirls used to mail hunky characters chocolates addressed to the devs. As usual, we went trawling through Japanese magazines looking for fun stories, rare trivia, and behind-the-scenes tidbits to translate for this video. So let's get into it. In America, Metroid Fusion's remembered for launching the same day as Metroid Prime, but in Japan, it came out a few months later on the same day as the Game Boy Advance SP. Sorta like how Metroid Dread released alongside the Switch OLED. Basically, as mid-generation refresh launch titles. Fusion's kinda considered the black sheep of 2D Metroid, and in a few interviews we had translated, director Yoshio Sakamoto elaborates why it was made that way. He says it had been 9 years since the last entry, so he expected old fans would be rusty, and if he hadn't taken it easy on them, he would have felt like a stubborn old man clinging to the past. Those middle schoolers that devoted countless hours to Super Metroid are adults now, and don't have the perseverance or endless free time they had a decade ago. Quote, "People told me, you can't do what you did 9 years ago, and I realized, oh yeah, guess everyone's grown up." One way he made it easier was dividing the game into small sectors and giving Samus constant directions and waypoints. In the past, providing explicit guidance, or even having text at all, was, quote, forbidden. This time, Fusion's got lots of text, which Sakamoto says he wrote all himself. Every word. He also made Fusion easier by, well, adding an easy mode. None of the previous entries had difficulty settings, but for Fusion, they implemented easy, normal, and hard. Only in Japan, though, where the game came out later and had a little more time in the oven. In the West, we didn't get those options. Sakamoto acknowledges that so much text, hand-holding, and easier difficulty sorta takes away from the essence of Metroid, but hoped that it would make things smoother not only for aging fans, but newcomers as well. Because despite being one of Nintendo's legacy franchises, as old as Zelda, it had never been a big seller. I think before, he said, Metroid was a series that pushed people away. It was just too hard and easy to get lost. The changes seem to have worked though, as Fusion ultimately sold even better than its predecessor, Super Metroid. A couple years later, they made Metroid Zero Mission and said in another interview it was a return to form that's harder, with less handholding and practically zero text. But ultimately, it only sold half as much as Fusion. After that, we didn't get another 2D Metroid for over a decade. Unfortunately, it seems the authentic Metroid experience really does have limited appeal. We say that as huge Metroid fans, by the way, with nothing but love. Or maybe we're misinterpreting the reasons for Zero Mission's low sales, seeing as the designers themselves said it was compromised in development. Murasawa Takayashi remarked, "I wish we'd made something richer." And Nakada Ryuichi explained, "We had a lot of things we wanted to add at first, but there were a lot of things we couldn't do to make it all happen. So we laid the groundwork as quickly as we could, and I think we achieved about half the things we wanted to include." He goes on to say, that's just how development goes sometimes, and despite all that, turned out to be a good game. It definitely was, though it is shorter than Super and Fusion. They also talk about the game's earlier aesthetic, with Chibi Samus looking like she did in the NES original. "We actually had a different art style at first," says Murasawa. "We made it look faithful to the original Metroid 1. We made it kind of cute with everything in that same style, but Nintendo of America told us to stop." Nakada adds, "NOA said Metroid needs to look realistic. It's a title that mostly sells overseas, so NOA's opinion was important. If Metroid was popular in Japan, though, this is probably how it would have looked at release." DK King of Swing was a game few played, but for the time, it had an interesting gimmick. The L button controls DK's left hand and R controls his right. When the team started development, that was the entire concept. We translated an interview from Nintendo Online Magazine's June 2005 issue, where it's revealed the game wasn't even supposed to include Donkey Kong at all. And the developers at Payon, an outside studio by the way, had never even made a Donkey Kong game before. "We started with an original character," remembers producer Toshiharu Izuno. "But I wanted it to be something that would sell well around the world. We thought if it was Donkey Kong, it might work, so we changed the character. We gave a presentation to Miyamoto, and he gave us the green light to commence full development." He goes on to say that for a while, they were making it for the GameCube that switched to handheld halfway through. Unfortunately, when it finally hit the GBA, it ended up one of the worst-selling games in the series. It reviewed decently though, with 7 out of 10s, so Nintendo let them make a sequel anyway, DK Jungle Climber for DS, which reviewed a little higher and sold a little better, but still not great, to be honest. Payon simultaneously developed Donkey Kong Barrel Blast for Wii, which turned out as the worst reviewed DK game of all time by far. Looking at these dates, you can see how much of a rough patch the mid-2000s was for the Big Ape. After that, Nintendo didn't let Payon make any more Donkey Kong games. In a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream Magazine, WarioWare's director Matsuoko Hirofumi says the game, and by extension, the entire WarioWare series, is sort of a sequel to a 64DD game that only sold a few thousand copies. More specifically, to a mode in Mario artist Polygon Studio called Sound Bomber, which was made up of a mere 8 microgames you could play through in literally 1 minute. It's some of the most obscure, least played content Nintendo's ever produced. Hirofumi was Polygon Studios' director, and after making Wario Land 4, wanted to make a continuation of Sound Bomber, this time with over 200 microgames. A lot of them are homages to old Nintendo products, with Hirofumi saying he went exploring around the office for stuff to make microgames out of. He ended up finding a lot of the late Gunpei Yokoi's inventions, the guy who had been Miyamoto's mentor and arguably made Nintendo what it is today. He made games out of Yokoi's 1970s light guns, the Ultra Machine, Rob the Robot, Dr. Mario, Duck Hunt, Wild Gunman, Virtual Boy, and countless more. As a result, a lot of WarioWare plays like an interactive Gunpei Yokoi museum. Hirofumi also talks about how WarioWare was the only game released the same day as the Game Boy Player, which let you play GBA on your TV. Hirofumi actively encourages readers to play WarioWare on the big screen with friends, or solo on the go. It's admittedly kind of a reach, but an argument could be made it was Nintendo's very first hybrid game, 14 years before the Switch. Sure, the Super Game Boy launched for Super Nintendo with Tetris 2 and Donkey Kong years before, but WarioWare was designed as a hybrid experience in a way those games simply weren't. Likewise, the GBA's connectivity with GameCube made for sort of a proto-Wii U experience, which itself was simplified to design the Switch. Nintendo's often praised for hardware innovation and unique ideas, including by us, though it's interesting to think how a lot of their seemingly out-of-left-field creations are really more refinements of ideas they had decades ago than they are brand new concepts. In another interview in issue 90 of Nintendo Dream, Castlevania series producer Koji Igarashi shows off his business card, which he likes to present upside down to create an inverted cross, a symbol of the devil. He says his wife designed it for him. Talking about Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, he explains why it's set in the future despite all previous entries taking place in the past. Basically, because they had no choice. He says, quote, Castlevania is a series with a lot of constraints in terms of story because Dracula resurrects once every 100 years, and even a timeline was released. We created it ourselves, after all. As you can see, there's no room left to insert any more stories where Dracula's revived. That's why we decided to make him appear in the future. The game begins with the protagonists getting sucked into a solar eclipse in Japan in the year 2035. Igarashi chose 2035 because there'll be a solar eclipse there in real life, in Japan, around 10 AM on September 2nd, to be exact. Unfortunately for us Western fans, it won't be visible on our side of the world. Besides its futuristic setting, another aspect that made Aria stand out was its soul system, which let you kill over 100 enemy types and gain their powers. Iga says the system was originally supposed to let you transform into all those monsters, but got downgraded to dominating them instead, because a GBA cartridge couldn't hold all the data for so many transformations, and making them all would have been a lot of work. Even with the reduced scope, Iga says the main programmer was miserable anyway. Speaking of that programmer, Iga shares some obscure behind the scenes, like why the skeleton waiter carries a bowl of curry, because in real life, the programmer eats nothing but curry. He also hates sushi, which is why despite being a healing item in previous games, there's not a single sushi to be found in Aria of Sorrow. Iga kept pestering him to add some into the game, but the programmer simply said no. If you haven't played Aria of Sorrow, by the way, you probably should. It's the best of the trilogy, and one of the highest reviewed games in the system's library. As a side note, Iga also mentions that after Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, they considered a direct sequel on PlayStation 2. But that, quote, developing a 2D game on PS2 was more challenging than anticipated. But on GBA, 2D's the norm, and it can achieve graphics roughly equivalent to Super Famicom. As good as the Castlevania games were on GBA, it sure would have been cool to see how the game that put the Vania in Metroidvania could have evolved on home console. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade was the series' 7th entry, but the first to come to the West. where it was simply called Fire Emblem. By then, Smash Bros. Melee had already been out a couple years and introduced the masses to Marth and Roy. According to Fire Emblem's producer, Toru Narihiro, Melee not only brought in a new audience of foreigners, but also Japanese children. In Nintendo Dream's 89th issue, they say Fire Emblem's possibly the Nintendo series with the oldest age demographic, averaging in their mid to late 20s, but now they had a bunch of elementary schoolers showing up too. Additionally, Sakurai was, quote, blunt with harsh criticism, saying the previous Fire Emblem was too difficult for modern audiences. Taking his criticisms to heart, and considering the influx of kids and foreigners, they decided to make Blazing Blade into something of a soft reboot, with lower difficulty, in hopes they could restore Fire Emblem to its former glory as one of Nintendo's flagship franchises. But they also added a trickier hard mode, to make it up to longtime fans who might be upset their adult series was getting watered down for the sake of the noobs. In addition to having an older audience than other series, Fire Emblem also had a large female player base, thanks in part to romance systems that let players woo each other and sometimes have kids together. So much so that Blazing Blade's director says girls used to send chocolates to their studio addressed to characters like Marth as a show of romantic affection. Another thing that made Blazing Blade different was that in older games, the player was the protagonists, but this time you play the part of an unseen military strategist who directs the protagonists. Initially, it was only supposed to work that way in the early game during Lynn's story to teach new players the ropes. After that, you take direct control of Eliwood for the second story. Nintendo higher-ups liked the strategist angle though, so they told the devs to make the entire game that way, and Blazing Blade had to get delayed several months to implement the change. Before launch, Nintendo supervisor Hitoshi Yamagami said outright that after Blazing Blade, they wanted to make a sequel on GameCube, but wouldn't be able to if Blazing Blade didn't sell enough. He was very explicit and practically begged people to buy it. Unfortunately, it undersold in Japan, but luckily sold a lot more overseas, thanks in part to Melee, so they were able to make the jump to GameCube with Path of Radiance in 2005.
Did you know? There were over 120 games planned to release on the Game Boy Advance that were ultimately cancelled. Ever wonder what they were and why they were canned? In this video, we'll be covering all of them, with a few exceptions. We'll leave out certain titles such as games that were rumored to exist but have no evidence to back them up, and hoaxes like the rumored Halo game for GBA. And while some titles are listed as cancelled on old gaming news sites, they did actually see a release, just not in the United States, so we won't be counting those either. We've also covered some cancelled GBA games on our cancelled DS games video, as many GBA projects were pushed to the DS after 2005, so we'll be skipping over those to avoid repeating ourselves. And with that said, let's jump into over an hour of cancelled Game Boy Advance games. Some of the most fondly remembered GBA titles belong to the Pokemon franchise, but there's one Pokemon game we never got to experience. A Pokemon title with MMO elements was once being developed for the Advance. The game would have been based on Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green when played on the handheld, but would become a 3D title based on the code and assets of Pokemon Coliseum when battling online using a computer. While online, players could trade, store Pokemon in servers, chat with other players, battle, and participate in online tournaments. It was pitched by Nintendo's co-owned Chinese studio iQ, and was planned to launch in 2005 with the online component releasing in 2006. Although the game would feature the entire Pokédex, Pokemon would be distributed based on the player's location by reading their IP address. These same readings would inform the title's weather patterns. Unfortunately, the game never surfaced, and neither Nintendo nor the Pokemon Company have really attempted anything like it since. Another scrap GBA game was Lunar Blaze, a sim RPG developed by HAL Laboratory, with Nintendo most likely planned to be publishing. First shown at Nintendo's Space World event in 2001, the title tasked players with recruiting various monsters. These creatures could be summoned to overcome large swarms of enemies. More than 170 kinds of attacks were planned for the game's battles, and each attack would be summoned by energy balls, with players having to distribute the energy to the monster's attacks. The game was canned a few months after it was first shown, and we're not certain why. Though Lunar Blaze's cancellation may remain a mystery, some titles have a very clear reason for being scrapped. Diddy Kong Pilot was a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing that focused on planes. Vehicles were controlled with the D-pad, but could also be controlled by tilting the GBA, as Pilot's cartridge had the same gyro tech Nintendo used in Kirby Tilt and Tumble. The title was announced at E3 2001, and demoed at E3 as well as Space World that year. The demo was praised for its graphics, but Nintendo became concerned about the game's quality. They felt the tilt controls had an underlying issue, as GBA titles were hard to see on the system if the screen wasn't aligned with a light source, and tilting it around could make games hard to see, but the title had other problems. Regarding the project, one programmer said Rare was micromanaging us into different directions, disregarding any hardware or cartridge space limitations. To no one's surprise, the game wasn't finished on time, and by late 2002, Microsoft acquired Rare in its entirety. Microsoft let Rare keep making GBA titles, as Microsoft wasn't in the handheld business, but Rare no longer had access to the Donkey Kong IP. Rare were eventually told to finish Diddy Kong Pilot, but retool it as a Banjo game, Banjo Pilot. Rare's Paul Rom said the retooling took 5 months, which included altering all the graphics, adding new racetracks, and the tilt controls being removed. Although Diddy Kong Pilot and Banjo Pilot use a Mode 7 style engine, at one point Rare tried rendering the backdrops using voxels, but the voxel engine had frame rate issues when sprites were added, so it was thrown out. But at least Diddy Kong Pilot lived on in some way. Other games were shelved before they even got off the ground. A document dating back to 2004 shows that publisher Vivendi Universal had plans for portable versions of the 2003 classic The Simpsons Hit and Run. The document outlines the handheld versions having the same scope and depth of the console game, with a wholesale price of $29.99. Although the original game had a T for teen rating, this version would be rated E for everyone. It was also proposed for the game to have tie-ins with The Simpsons Season 4 DVD, which came out in June 2004. The GBA port had a tentative shipping date for the 4th quarter of 2004, with a PSP date listed in the 1st quarter of 2005. When this document was brought to the attention of Hit and Run's lead programmer, Carrie Brisbois, he said the PSP port was up and running and looked pretty sweet. Carrie had heard about the GBA version, but never saw it for himself. And this isn't the only cancelled 3D open-world title on the platform. In May 2001, publisher DSi Games had a number of licenses under its belt, with a GBA port of Grand Theft Auto 3 among them. This version was set to release alongside the console game that October, but a year later, GTA was still MIA. DSi stated the title was still in its early stages, and from 2002 all the way to spring 2003, its projected launch dates kept getting pushed back. On November 5, 2002, after rumors spread of GTA's cancellation, DSi dispelled these rumors and had an announcement planned for the end of that week. On November 8th, news leaked that Crawfish Interactive were developing the game, but exactly 1 week later, it was announced the studio closed its doors due to a myriad of problems. In July 2003, several former Crawfish staff came forward and shared tons of info about their version of GTA 3, from the game's graphic style to its controls and more. Come 2016, games archivist Andrew Borman showcased 2 early demos of Crawfish's GTA, with the builds both compiled in April 2002, only days apart. A Grand Theft Auto title would release on GBA in 2004, but this game was developed by Digital Eclipse and served as a prequel to GTA 3. But the system had plenty of family-friendly titles that were nixed. Donkey Kong Plus is an unreleased game demoed at E3 2002. Nintendo planned for the game to be a sequel of sorts to Donkey Kong on Game Boy, which is more commonly known as Donkey Kong 94. What's interesting about this project is that players could make their own Donkey Kong-style levels on the GameCube and send them to the GBA, Mario Maker style. Although the title never came out, it clearly served as the basis for Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which came out 2 years later. The game's sequel, Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis for the DS, even had its own level editor, just like Donkey Kong Plus. It was also discovered that unused code for a level editor exists in Mario vs. Donkey Kong on GBA, tying the projects together further. Despite their strong connection, it's still uncertain if Donkey Kong Plus is the same project as Mario vs. Donkey Kong, or if DK Plus simply inspired it. Other retro titles were set to have a GBA release too. A handheld remake of the original Battletoads was found among several other axed Rare titles in the mid-2000s. The now-defunct YouTuber Transparent Jinjo uploaded footage of the game, showing its pre-rendered graphics. Although the game used the same tech that made Donkey Kong Country's art possible, the revamped Battletoads had a more cartoony style that contrasted the original vision of Battletoads. The game wasn't in development for long, with only one actually playable level and many reused sound effects from other Rare titles like Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. As well as a short and rushed production, the game also lacked a clear direction. The team working on Battletoads were given conflicting guidance by those in charge, such as make it a shiny clone of the NES game and just do whatever you think works best. They were even told to leave out any cool ideas they had for this project and save them for an Xbox version. This wasn't the only scrap GBA title that was dismissed by higher-ups. Davide Soliani is best known today as the director of Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, but he's been a Nintendo fan for years, and when Wind Waker hit store shelves, he loved it so much he spent a month making a Wind Waker sequel on GBA with Ubisoft artist Fabio Paghetti. Paghetti told Did You Know Gaming, "We were both in love with Wind Waker, and Nintendo handhelds were the major focus of Ubisoft Milan at the time, so Davide and I were wondering how Wind Waker would look on GBA. Eventually I prepared this mock-up and we also worked on some 3D test scenes, but we never got the opportunity to pitch the game to Nintendo. The duo made a pitch with several tests to go with it, but when they showed their prototype to the managing and studio directors at Ubisoft, they decided to kill the project before Nintendo ever got a chance to see it. Unfortunately, the pitch itself is lost, and all that remains is this single image. Going from an actual Zelda game to one that was heavily inspired by the series, Dark Knight was an action RPG inspired by Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. The game stood out not only because of its detailed visuals, but also because of its day and night system. When the game transitioned from day into night, or vice versa, the title's presentation and certain parts of the gameplay would change. One example the developers gave was an old man changing into a werewolf at night. The game would have had about 30 hours of gameplay and was planned to release in 2004. However, the devs at Nap's team failed to find a publisher for the project, and the title was shelved. Some developers have had publishing issues, even after being backed by Nintendo directly. Bits Studios teamed up with Nintendo to make a real-time strategy game called Warlocked for the Game Boy Color in 2000. The game was well received by critics and gamers alike, but sales were low, likely due to a lack of interest in the genre outside the PC market. Despite this, Bits Studios began work on a GBA sequel to Warlocked called Wizards, sometimes referred to as Warlocked 2. Much like the original, players would move a cursor with the D-pad and give commands with buttons to imitate a computer mouse. This time around, it seems Nintendo wasn't interested in publishing the project, and neither was anyone else. Bits Studios couldn't find a publisher and had to scrap the project. Bits were also developing a jet ski racer called Jet Riders, inspired by Wave Race. It was due to be finished in December 2001 and published in early 2002, but with an unknown publisher. Jet Riders incorporated real-time water effects and backgrounds with pre-rendered 3D sprites, making it stand out visually from many other early GBA titles. Players could choose from 5 modes including practice, races, stunts, time trial, and multiplayer. This would have been single-pack multiplayer, meaning only one cartridge was needed between up to 4 players. The game had a stunt system with tricks being performed over ramps, gaps, crevice jumps, as well as on rails. The game had 6 racers to choose from, and 21 tracks. It's not known exactly why the game was canned, and Bits Studios kept making games until 2006. When the Game Boy Advance was first announced, Nintendo showed off a Yoshi tech demo to illustrate the power of the console. This demo seemed to be a GBA port of Yoshi's story, but had a few differences. The game started with a spinning Yoshi's Island rotating, then faded into a Yoshi's Story-inspired level that loops. The game has a different health system as well, and when Yoshi ground pounds, he slams with his head instead of his rear. The demo also had toadies as enemies, who dropped spiked balls and thwomp-like creatures on players. Though the game is assumed to be a cancelled title, it's currently unknown whether Nintendo actually intended to release it as a game. That said, Nintendo have shown plenty of tech demos in the past that have turned into full games, like the Balloon Trip demo for DS became Yoshi Touch and Go. Some tech demos aren't as well known, but were impressive nonetheless. Turok was set to have a 3D first-person shooter on the GBA, as can be seen in this early prototype which surfaced in 2009. This title was loosely based on the original N64 game, but lacked any enemies, besides one stationary target that the player can spawn using the B button. It's believed this iteration of Turok was abandoned in favor of Turok Evolution, which launched in 2002 on the Advance. This project was short-lived, but some other projects actually spanned 3 generations of Nintendo hardware. Game Boy Music was a rhythm action title originally originally developed for the Game Boy Color by Nintendo. The project shifted to the GBA when devs saw they could improve the quality of the game's audio on the Advance. The project was announced in March 2001 at the Tokyo Game Show and planned to release that same year. Game Boy Music had 45 songs and around 50 instruments, which could be used in 5-player jam sessions. It would have also been packaged with the Game Boy Speaker, a cancelled speaker peripheral that was planned to improve audio quality. But the game, which was originally planned for the Game Boy Color, was pushed back even further onto the Nintendo DS. After a lot of reworking, the title finally emerged as the Japan-exclusive Daigasso Band Brothers, and even got a sequel on DS that released in Europe as Jam with the Band. Another Nintendo title on our list is Batland, an action strategy game developed by HAL Laboratory, set to be published by Nintendo. It was first shown off at Space World 2001, and was set to be planned for a Spring '02 launch. The title focused on action and strategy, with a character's positioning on the battlefield being the key to victory. Weaker characters could even overcome strong enemies with the right tactics. Based on this and the game's presentation, it seems the game took some cues from the Fire Emblem franchise. The title would even make use of the GBA link cable, letting multiple players fight against each other, even if they only had one copy of the game. Little else is known about the game's development. Shantae 2 Risky Revolution, also known as Shantae Advance, was a sequel to the 2002 Game Boy Color title Shantae. It was developed by WayForward Technologies and would have featured new abilities like flying across Sequin Land on Sky's Bird Wrench, and Shantae could move between the foreground and background. The game had a 4-player battle mode, and its plot involved Risky Boots using a tremor engine to wipe out Sequin Land. Shantae could later use the tremor engine to change scenery and access new areas. Unfortunately, the original Shantae didn't sell well, which meant WayForward lacked a publisher and had to cancel the project. Several features, like the fore and background switching, were repurposed for Shantae Risky's Revenge. The title was streamed on Twitch by series creator Matt Bozon in October 2014, showing a glimpse of what could have been. As well as your more traditional games, the GBA had some scrapped projects that were highly experimental. Hanasaki Kasen, which means flower blooming competition in Japanese, is a cancelled real-time strategy game that was being made by Blue Planet Software, who made the original Tetris for Game Boy. The project was one of the first games announced for the GBA, and was being funded and published by Nintendo themselves. However, no images or video of the game ever surfaced. Unseen64 tried to get in contact with developers from Blue Planet Software to find out more about the title, but to no avail. The only information currently available comes from developer resumes, all of which imply that AI played a large role in the game. One staffer had this to say: "There were many factors that the AI needed to evaluate, and simulated annealing was used to allow the AI to learn strategies by playing itself overnight, adjusting its internal weights until the best strategy was found. The AI could thus adjust to changing game rules, and even discover new strategies. It's clear the game was about breeding flowers, and involved some fairly complicated programming for the GBA. One cancelled GBA title that Square Enix fans might mourn is a Secret of Mana remake. After the release of Sword of Mana in 2003, plans were made to remake Secret of Mana in the same art style. It wasn't until July 2018 that the world learned of its existence, when Mana artist Shinichi Kameoka shared artwork he did for the game on his Twitter, as well as a screenshot from the game itself. Aside from those tidbits, virtually nothing else had been shared about this title's development. Speaking of remakes, Mega Man Anniversary Collection, known as Mega Man Mania, is a cancelled portable anniversary collection of Mega Man games. But unlike the home console collections, this release would have featured the uniquely different Game Boy versions of Mega Man 1 through 5, all in full color, with an option for black and white graphics for purists. The title had behind-the-scenes extras like concept art and the like as well. The game was delayed multiple times, and was even rumored to switch handhelds from the GBA to the Nintendo DS, but was ultimately never released. One more canned DK title for the GBA was first announced at E3 2003. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers was planned to come out in 2003, but much like Diddy Kong Pilot, the Microsoft buyout in 2002 meant that Rare lost access to the Donkey Kong IP. The game was called Donkey Kong Puzzle Paint in its early stages, but after the Microsoft buyout, the title went through even more reworkings. Its name changed to Splunge, then Nutcracker, Animal Cracker, and Sunflower. The team at Rare even considered making it a part of the Banjo-Kazooie or Saberman franchises, but finally released the game in 2004 as It's Mr. Pants. Mr. Pants was a crudely drawn mustached stickman Man, who was the mascot of the survey section of Rare's website. Amusingly, artwork for Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers managed to find its way into the trailer for the 2012 comedy Food Fight. Another scrapped Nintendo project on GBA belonged to the Custom Robo franchise. 2002's Custom Robo GX for the Advance was planned to receive a sequel called Custom Robo GX2, being made by series creator Noise with Nintendo as publisher. It was slated for release in late 2005, but by this point the GBA was at the tail end of its life cycle. Work on the game was shelved in favor of a Nintendo DS title instead, which was released as Custom Robo Arena in 2006. The game's developers briefly mentioned the title in an interview on Nintendo's Japanese website, and little else is known outside of what was said on the site. While some advanced titles remain overlooked, the UK developer Pocketeers managed to grab the attention of the gaming press in the early 2000s with its C2 game engine. Using this engine, Pocketeers made an impressive recreation of Quake's gameplay on the GBA to demonstrate the engine. However, this was simply a demo, and the company had no intent to pitch the project to id Software or Activision. One project using the engine may have actually been planned as a full game, but it's a little unclear. TWOC, an acronym for Taking Without Owner's Consent, was a GTA 3 style title on GBA. TWOC had indoor and outdoor areas, 3D vehicles, shading effects, MIP mapping, and advanced physics for vehicle control and collision. When talking about the game, one developer told a member of PortableGaming.de, "What you see in the videos are demos of game engines. That means that they're more than simple tech demos, but less than a game. They're more than a tech demo, as some elements of gameplay, physics, and collision have been implemented to show publishers how the game will feel and play. In a final game, we would hope for around 50 to 100 different car types and as many different types of pedestrians." The fact that devs speculated on how a full title would work makes it seem like Pocketeers were shopping the demo around to publishers in hopes of turning it into a full game, but this is just speculation. Even Nintendo themselves made some pitches that failed. There was a time where Nintendo wanted to obtain the exclusive rights to the Harry Potter license. In 1998, Nintendo of America's internal team, Nintendo Software Technologies, made a pitch for the Harry Potter license. If it went through, it's possible the films people know today would never have existed. When news broke of the license being auctioned off, Nintendo halted work on 3 titles being made at NST, and split the devs into 2 teams for 2 Harry Potter pitches. One larger team was in charge of a third-person adventure title, and a smaller team for a title based on the series' in-universe game of Quidditch. NST had plans to release the potential projects on N64, GBA, and future platforms like the GameCube. Over the course of a week, the teams put together several pieces of artwork to showcase to the book's author, J.K. Rowling, but both parties didn't completely see eye to eye. In the end, Rowling declined Nintendo's offer, and the series' rights were eventually sold off to Warner Brothers, and while various games made their way to Nintendo consoles, the ones being made at NST were scrapped. You may have already heard about Raylight Studios and their spectacular Blue Roses engine. Using Blue Roses, Raylight made many tech demos for GBA, such as the Metal Gear Solid Hangar demo, and probably the most well-known, a demo of Resident Evil 2 on the Advance. Raylight also made a demo based on the original Resident Evil, but not much is known about this prototype. What we do know, however, is that these demos were actually pitched to Capcom as full games, and Capcom were interested in bringing them to the handheld. In an Unseen 64 interview with Raylight Studios CEO Massimiliano Di Monda said, "At the time we were invited to the Capcom offices in the UK. We discussed the project at various levels, but then Capcom Japan vetoed it because of the downturn of the GBA, adding the fact that a mature game was not suitable for that type of console." Another big franchise that had a scrap title on the Game Boy Advance is Sonic the Hedgehog. A port of Sonic Riders was planned for the Advance, but due to the system being extremely limited in power compared to home consoles like the PS2, this version of the game was going to be quite different, and would have had gameplay similar to Outrun. The GBA version was listed in the resume of Arvin Bautista, and the portfolio of Keith Erickson, who posted the only known piece of art from the game, a simple waving flag. Apparently the port was cancelled due to Sega of Japan insisting that more 3D elements make their way into the game, but this couldn't be done within a reasonable time frame, so Sega of America axed the project. The GBA also had several canned titles based on cartoons. Though the Warner Brothers series Animaniacs had long ended by the early 2000s, it was still getting video game tie-ins. Animaniacs Hollywood Hypnotics was set to be published by Swing Entertainment and developed by Full Fat Games. Its story had the brain using the WB water tower as a rocket, sending out audio signals that sounded like barking dogs. With the whole world shouting at their neighbors to keep their dogs quiet, Pinky and the Brain would step in in to take advantage of the confusion and conquer the world. The Warner siblings are immune to the sound, so it's up to them to set things back to normal. This game was a 2D platformer with a number of settings, and various Animaniacs characters would serve as enemies or ways to interact with puzzles. It was canned when Swing Entertainment declared bankruptcy on February 11, 2003. Hollywood Hypnotics was set to release alongside a console title called Hollywood Hijinks, though that game actually came out as The Great Edgar Hunt in 2005, with a new developer and publisher to boot. And this wasn't the only canned cartoon game. Augie and the Cockroaches was also planned to have its own 2D platformer on the GBA. Based on the French cartoon of the same name, players would take control of Augie and grab collectibles and jump on enemies across 14 stages and 7 boss areas. The game was being developed by Zlam and was set to be published by Telegames, but it never made it to store shelves, and no reason was ever given as to why. Speaking of animated projects with an unknown demise, in the early 2000s, Incubus Inc. developed a prototype based on Mr. Bean the animated series, aptly titled Adventures of Mr. Bean. The game matched the cartoon style faithfully, with hand-drawn backgrounds and characters. The proto had 6 levels spanning various genres, all apparently focused on the comedic nature of the show. It's unclear why the game never got picked up for full production, but this isn't the only project Incubus were making at the time. Incubus also developed a prototype called Rabbitator, Never Cry. The title had, quote, arcade and logical components, and a system based on Tamagotchi. They also made Underseas Adventures of Agent 00 Cat. This game had fairly well-rendered 3D models, 4 layers of parallax backgrounds, and a dynamic tiling system. It had 12 different levels full of puzzles and full-screen animations. Another Incubus project was Morhun Jagd, a port of a classic German PC game of the same name. And although a similar-looking Morhun game did release on the GBA, it wasn't this title. The studio even made a port of the arcade game Viewpoint for the GBA, but this was simply to test the team's development tools and was never planned to be released. Some titles on the Advance were cancelled simply because they were too ambitious. The GBA version of The Sims Bustin' Out was once a straight port of the original Sims game for PC, but on the Advance. Even though the original Sims was very basic, the simulation gameplay of the title didn't translate very well to the GBA's hardware, and a different direction had to be taken. This new approach was inspired by the first console version of The Sims, where players could follow their Sims story in a more personal way that resembled a traditional adventure game. Using this premise, producer of the title J.C. Connors pitched to EA what would become Bustin' Out on the Game Boy Advance. It's fascinating to consider what the Advance title would have looked like if they managed to pull off a port of the original PC game on GBA, but it'll have to stay in our imaginations. One more ambitious unreleased title is Dune, Ornithopter Assault. The game was a 3D shooter based on the Frank Herbert novel Dune, which entered development sometime in 2001. Although it had a promising start, by summer 2002, production had stopped outright due to financial issues at Cryo Interactive. The title's cancellation is particularly unfortunate, as the game was almost done, with just multiplayer mode and the briefing room left on the cutting room floor. There is a silver lining, however. A ROM of the game leaked online in 2015, with a seemingly complete single-player campaign. Another scrap GBA title with impressive visuals is the action RPG Spiral Stone. The title had a lot of hype surrounding it, as its developer Gatehouse Games was founded by top talent from Core Design, the creators of Tomb Raider. The game was described by one developer as a mix of Diablo and EverQuest with the collection and trading aspects of Pokemon. Spiral Stone had hundreds of quests, but with a fluid story that was defined by the player. It also had a multiplayer feature that let players team up to fight enemies, solve puzzles, trade items, or fight each other in arenas. The title even had 3D characters in its menus, which were fairly imposing for the GBA. Despite how well crafted the game was, Gatehouse failed to find a publisher for it, even after pitching a GameCube version as well. The company ended up going under in 2003, putting an end to Spiral Stone. Having impressive visuals is starting to seem like a death sentence for GBA games. The Haunted Mansion was an adventure game developed by Pocket Studios and planned to be published by TDK Media Active for the GBA. The title was in development around the same time as the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube builds, but unlike those titles, the Advance version was never released. All versions of the game were based on the Disneyland ride of the same name, but the GBA game was a unique experience compared to the home console versions. Players would explore the mansion, finding keys, avoiding enemies, and completing some on-rails sections as well as some Nancy Drew-esque point-and-click segments. The main reason for the title's cancellation was that the publisher TDK Media Active was bought out by Take-Two during development, and Take-Two didn't seem to care about the title. Another Nix GBA game that had a lot of potential was Static Shock. Based on the animated animated show of the same name, Static Shock was set to release in 2004 and was first shown off at E3 2003. The game let players take control of the titular hero to thwart villains such as Hotstreak and the Breed. Static's superpowers enable players to sky surf, generate force fields, and throw bolts of lightning, but players could also use their static powers to interact with several background objects, turning them into all kinds of useful tools and projectiles, such as energizing manhole covers to become flying discs. The promising title never materialized, however, though it got far enough in development for Nintendo Power to review the game. The Metal Slug series saw an entry on GBA in 2004, but publisher SNK had plans for even more games. In 2005, a remake of the first Metal Slug was making its way to GBA and was said to be a perfect port of the arcade title. Nothing new and nothing removed. A Famitsu article dated September 2005 also said the handheld would receive ports for Metal Slug 2, 3, and X. GameSpot and IGN got to play the game during GDC in March 2006, and while still in an early state, it showed promise. SNK was aiming for a September 06 release to mark the series' 10th anniversary, but ultimately missed the mark. And in October, Famitsu confirmed the other Metal Slug games were canned as well. In 2007, SNK Playmore's US website gave an official statement for Metal Slug's axing, stating it was due to limited memory on the GBA cartridge, and asked players to buy the Metal Slug Anthology on Wii, PS2, or PSP to play the title instead. In June 2020, Hidden Palace user Ndrift dumped a prototype of the game, alongside an early version of Metal Slug Advance, but still no news on the other titles. In 2004, French studio Delphine closed its doors due to bankruptcy. They were famous for creating critically acclaimed adventure games like Another World and Flashback. Due to the company's closure, titles that were in development at the time had to be scrapped. One of these games was Flashback Legend, a new entry in the Flashback franchise for the GBA featuring the series' signature gameplay. The game had 16 levels, but only 9 were playable due to its unfinished state. Although the title was never completed, a prototype ROM was dumped online, giving fans a taste of what could have been. Speaking of cancelled games from French companies, a handheld version of Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon was in the works for the N-Gage and the GBA, with Ubisoft as publisher. A listing even appeared on Nintendo's own site for the Advance Edition, slating a release for April 2003. Unfortunately, this is just about all that's known about this port. On April 3, 2002, Ubisoft also announced a deal with Fox Interactive to make Alien vs. Predator titles until 2003, and one of these games was set to appear on GBA. All that's known of the title is a statement from Ubisoft's president Laurent Detoc, with him saying they looked forward to bringing all the excitement of the franchise to a handheld system. One other acclaimed horror series almost came to GBA. The system was planned to get a game based on the horror classic The Thing. Universal Interactive and Konami announced the title in September 2000, with it also being made for the Game Boy Color. Despite John Carpenter's remake of The Thing being the best-known version of the film, IGN reported that the GBA game was mainly based on the original 1951 film, with a new plot following up from where the film ended. The console versions of the game were based around the Carpenter film, so it's possible IGN was given the wrong info. Although the home console titles launched in late 2002, handheld ports never materialized. Contraband Entertainment were making an action-adventure title for the GBA called Monster Hunter, not to be confused with Capcom's massive franchise of the same name. Monster Hunter was announced in early 2003, and was apparently based on a PC version the team were making at the time. The game's website also stated that Fallout designer Scott Campbell was working on the title. In Monster Hunter, players are tasked with destroying different beasts inhabiting various mazes. In these labyrinths, players had to find specific weapons to eliminate specific monsters, and using the wrong weapon on a monster can actually make it stronger, so planning and strategy were very important. Contraband went on an extended hiatus sometime around the end of 2003, which is probably why we've heard nothing on the game since. This isn't the only unused concept where players kill monsters in a top-down perspective on GBA. Serious Sam saw a release on the Advance, but during the early stages of production, developer Climax London seemed to have had another idea in mind for the project. The final game was a first-person point of view, but this video evidence shows a top-down style was attempted. Whatever the case, this version seems to have been shot down in favor of something that better lined up with fan expectations. Many of the GBA's most promising prototypes were original IPs. Pirate Battle was a turn-based strategy RPG announced announced in 2004 by Orbital Media. The title was inspired by Front Mission 3, Fire Emblem, Advance Wars, and Final Fantasy Tactics, but it distinguished itself with an interactive battleground. Players could knock over a statue to damage the enemy behind it, or push a barrel into water to be used as a stepping stone. The team for Pirate Battle was small, with most of the game being made by just 3 people. Unfortunately, the game was shelved for unclear reasons, though an understaffed development team may have contributed to its cancellation. The title was reworked slightly for a potential DS release, but this too was scrapped. Another cancelled RPG for the system was just as ambitious, but had a very different approach to the genre. Sometime in the early 2000s, Marvelous Entertainment were prototyping a fully 3D RPG for the GBA titled Dark Empire. The game looked quite promising despite it clearly being unfinished. Humorously, Marvelous had temporarily been using images of famous actors like Mel Gibson for character portraits, an indication of how early the prototype was. The title was completely unheard of until an online auction in 2009, and would be dumped online in 2018 at obscuregamers.com. Other cancelled titles were far less obscure. An entry in the tile-matching puzzle game series Bejeweled was planned for the GBA. The game was announced by its publisher Majesco in 2004, where a press release said both PopCap's Bejeweled and Bookworm would be going handheld. Bookworm ultimately launched in 2004, but Bejeweled never showed up. Bookworm's gameplay on the Advance was faithful to the PC version, and we can only assume Bejeweled would have been a faithful port as well. One other scrapped Majesco title comes from the Boy and His Blob series. The franchise actually had a couple attempts at getting a game out the door, with the GBA title being one of the casualties. Announced May 18, 2001, Majesco revealed a Boy and His Blob, Jelly's Cosmic Adventure, was in the works at their internal studio Pipe Dream Interactive. It was expected to see release in 2002, and it's not known why it was cancelled, though it's believed the publisher ran into financial issues. Speaking of familiar franchises, Swing Entertainment had a title from a grand IP. Developed by Tantalus Games, Flintstones Dino to the Rescue was a 2D platformer where Dino and the Great Gazoo saved the Flintstones and the Rubbles from alien invaders. Tantalus' own website boasted Dino as the most versatile character on the Game Boy Advance, with over 15 moves at his disposal. The title would have had 42 different levels and a mix of 2D and 3D environments. Dino's model was fully rendered in 3D, and some bonus levels even made use of a Mode 7 effect. In September 2003, Tantalus producer John Zoki did an interview with PlanetGameBoy.de saying Dino to the Rescue would be out soon. Apparently the game was finished before one of their other titles, Top Gear Rally, but the team ran into publishing issues. In issue 1 of Australian Game Pro magazine, Tantalus employee Tom Crago also said the game would be out in 2004. That seems to be the last update on the game, with all hopes of release going the way of the dinosaurs. A cancelled game you might actually be glad never got a release on GBA is Charlie's Angels. Based on the franchise's early 2000s films, Charlie's Angels also got a video game tie-in on the PS2 and GameCube, published by Ubisoft and developed by Neko Entertainment. It was apparently announced for Xbox, Windows, and of course Game Boy Advance, but given the title's awful reception, it seems they backpedaled on this decision and scrapped it, saving many their time and money. Another game that got a home console release but never surfaced on the Advance is iNinja. A version of the title was reportedly being developed by Destination Software for the GBA in 2004, a year after the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox versions. This build was unique due to the limitations of the GBA, but was still 3D. The title had a mix of fast-paced inertia run levels, combat arenas, and ball rolling levels across 5 worlds, 4 islands and a moon base, with a giant boss at the end of each. It's unknown why this version was cancelled. One more axed project with imposing 3D graphics came from Karma Studios in 2002. The team were making Radium for the Advance, with the game planned to be published by Telegames in April 2003 in the United States. Radium plays out in a third-person perspective with the impressive 3D Radium engine, which is capable of texture mapping, depth shading and fogging, 3D mirrors, and has a dynamic camera. When players trigger certain events, the camera will swoop around to show different parts of the area. The title was set to take place over 4 unique worlds and 16 different stages. Players would escape from prison, but with scientists and soldiers out to stop them. In early previews, the game was criticized due to its frame rate dipping when the action got intense, and the character's sprite blocked the player's view immediately in front of the sprite, making targeting enemies a chore at times. The game received a trailer saying coming soon, but was quietly cancelled sometime after. Another game that quietly bowed out was the platformer RPG hybrid Kian. The title title had a hectic development and was picked up and dropped on at least 3 separate occasions. On October 30th, 2002, European publisher GMX Media was set to release the game in PAL regions for spring 2003, but to no avail. Other publishers once attached to the title included Ingram Entertainment and Destination Software Inc., or DSI for short. Kian was actually finished and sent out to a few gaming publications in fall 2003. Both Pocket Games and issue 154 of Nintendo Power apparently gave it a score of 60. The title's controls were cited as responsive, but criticism came from its lack of depth and difficulty spikes. The title was pulled from the system's lineup due to one publisher believing a new IP would be a hard sell. In the years since, the game's ROM has surfaced online, and currently, developer PM Studios is working on a title called Astral Equilibrium, which is directly inspired by Kian. In fact, the game's trailer even features Kian footage. Another scrapped game with a cute art style is Odema and the Magic Book. Originally developed at Namdu, this title was seen as a kid-friendly Metal Slug, being helmed by a team of 4, 2 programmers, 1 QA tester, and 1 artist. By mid-2004, Namdu said on their website that the title's most important sections were finished, and they were looking for any interested publishers. That's where the original game's story ends, but in November 2019, Pico Interactive contacted members of the dev team and secured the rights to Odema. The publisher currently has a Spanish-based team developing it for the Neo Geo, though when Pico bought the rights, not only was the game incomplete, but the version they received from one of the programmers was not the latest version. The project's other programmer left the company for personal reasons, and either sold most of his software or threw it away. Still, Pico is set to put the game together and release it someday, and shared several of its source files for preservational purposes. Shining Star was a military-based strategy game being made by eWorks Studios in 2005. It starred a military man named Cool Shen, who was accompanied by 2 support characters, a short-tempered colonel named Shurkin, and a female commander named Dragon Ash, who had a more positive approach to helping the player. The title's visuals were inspired by titles like Riviera and the Metal Slug series, where things like dialogue took a page from Advance Wars. eWorks even wanted to create a unique type of AI for the game's foes, where they'd react to the player's strategies and movements. Despite communication issues between the studio and producer, a playable prototype was made with a few areas to explore. Several other roadblocks stood in the team's way, however. Not only was the GBA nearing the end of its life, but eWorks was unable to obtain a DS dev kit and no publisher was in sight. The team later thought about reworking the game in 3D and making it a digital download title, which also never came to be. More strategy games almost came to the GBA. Commandos 2 Men of Courage was a strategy game released in 2001 for the PC, PS2, and Xbox. It's the only Commandos title playable on home consoles, but it was also planned for a handheld release. A ROM of a proposed GBA version was published online in 2020 by the preservationists at Forest of Illusion. The prototype was apparently made by Toyonaka Studios and pitched to Pyro Studios and series publisher Eidos Interactive. The game seems quite different to the original, not only in gameplay but in presentation. Players took control of one character via the D-pad rather than using a cursor. It's unknown why the title was scrapped, but if we had to guess, it was due to RTS games historically having poor sales on Nintendo handhelds, as was the case with Warlocked on the Game Boy Color. Back to GBA titles that had impressive visuals. The Formula 1 Sega-branded racer Virtua Racing may have had a chance on the Advance. 2 programmers at Dream On Studio created an unofficial mock-up of Virtua Racing, hoping they'd catch the eye of Sega and get the chance to make a GBA port. The studio's director uploaded footage of this pitch and said the game didn't go through due to changes in Sega management and the arrival of the upcoming Nintendo DS. But this wasn't the only stunning racer for GBA that was axed. Sometime around 2001, Shinen Multimedia were developing a 3D engine for the Advance and tested it by prototyping a top-down racing game. The unnamed prototype, which seems to combine elements of Micro Machines and F-Zero, was ultimately scrapped as Shinen was busy developing other titles. However, some elements of the prototype found its way into future titles. From experimentation, Shinen learned how to manipulate the GBA's RAM for faster data transfer, which was used while making titles like the visually imposing Iridion 2. Another nixed title was The Sword of Saya, Lady Saya 2, a cancelled action-adventure title developed by RFX Interactive around 2002. It was a sequel to Lady Saya on GBA, and seemed to have similar gameplay to the original. Unfortunately, RFX had to close its doors in 2003, and if Lady Saya 2 wasn't doomed enough, the game's publisher TDK Media Active was acquired by Take-Two in December the same year. Even more tragic is that Lady Saya 2 was actually rated by the ESRB, indicating the project was extremely close to completion when it was cancelled. Another 2D adventure title that never managed to find its way to the GBA was Heart of Darkness. This was a cinematic platform game released on the PS1 in July 1998. On February 16, 2001, a GBA port was announced, planned to be published in Europe by Infogrames. A GameSpot article covering this announcement noted the lack of release date and a North American publisher, which were likely factors in its cancellation. Overstorm was a scrapped action platformer of a similar vein, which had been described as a mix between Donkey Kong Country, Oddworld, and Tomb Raider. According to Unseen64, the game was shown off only once at an unnamed gaming convention in 2003, but was later shelved. The title was unexpectedly given new life over 10 years later, by none other than its original developers. The devs decided to give away a 5-level alpha build of the game in 2014 as part of a sale for the online storefront Indie Game Stand. Another title, destined to never see the GBA, was developed by and planned to be published by Sonari Interactive. Aegis The Awakening was a fantasy RPG first announced in early 2002, with GameSpot being one of the few outlets able to get hands-on time with the game. According to them, the title had two different gameplay styles to choose from, a 3D arena-style mode reminiscent of Final Fight, and a side-scrolling style in the vein of Castlevania. The Mega Man series also served as an inspiration, as after a boss was defeated, a new skill would be obtained to help take on the next area. Players could choose between two warriors, with each one offering a different feel. The game also had a two-player mode where players could compete against and cooperate with each other. At that point, the game was still in its infancy, and a blurb on Sonari's website in 2003 listed the concept as completed. No reason was given for its cancellation, though some theorized it was dropped due to Sonari shifting their focus to the cell phone market. In October 2002, the studio entered an exclusive contract with Jamdat Mobile, which could have been a possible factor in Aegis' axing. Taurus Games, who'd gained some prominence after porting Duke Nukem Advance and Doom 2 to the GBA, revealed in 2003 that they'd make a 3D voxel engine for the system. They demonstrated the engine with Moto X, a dirt bike racing game that showcased free-roaming dirt biking over varying terrain. The game was planned to feature both single and multiplayer challenges, all while maintaining 20 frames per second. The title had no publisher attached, which we can only assume is the reason it never released. Speaking of 3D titles, Urban Reflex was an FPS that not only looked pretty decent, but had a noticeably smooth frame rate for a 3D GBA game. Developers Graphic State also made a fairly impressive port of Crazy Taxi on GBA, as well as Dark Arena, and clearly had a talented team. A January 2003 IGN article stated the title was finishing development and hinted it'd be released before the end of summer that year. Despite this, Graphic State failed to find a publisher for the project. This didn't matter, however, as the company shut down in 2003, taking Urban Reflex with it. On the subject of shoot-'em-ups, EFX was a shooter in the works at Karma Studios, though this game took a more 3D approach, seemingly taking inspiration from titles like Space Harrier. It was said to have 6 worlds and a multitude of weapons and upgrades to collect. Not much else is known about its development, however. Thankfully, we do know a fair amount about Dinotopia 2, a cancelled sequel to Dinotopia: The Timestone Pirates, which was based on the Dinotopia series of books. Timestone Pirates was also developed for GBA by RFX Interactive, and sold well enough for publisher TDK Media Active to greenlight a sequel. Although Dinotopia 2 shared a franchise and system with the original game, this sequel unexpectedly switched genres from an action platformer to a point-and-click adventure. It also would have retold the same story, or something very similar. The game didn't get far in development, as TDK went out of business in 2003. RFX was ultimately saved by a purchase from Take-Two Interactive, but this sequel had to be left behind. Treasure Hunt was another prototype action-adventure that was visually ambitious to say the least. It was inspired by point-and-click games and titles like Zelda, with the team's personal goal being to make it the best-looking game on the GBA. The game didn't have much programming support at Orbital Media, and was mainly the work of a few enthusiastic artists. The game was shown at a few conventions, but very little remains online. Some aspects of it do live on though, as some characters were reimagined and put into the title Juka and the Monophonic Menace. However, the two games have little in common besides this. Another Axe title with Hunt in its name is Demon Hunter, a Diablo-inspired RPG by independent Independent Arts Software. The project was ambitious, despite lacking a publisher. It had 8 huge areas planned, all split into procedurally generated sub-levels with a different layout every time they were played. A 2002 IGN preview also mentioned how a focus was replayability, with gamers able to replay areas with more powerful enemies that scaled to their level. Since the title lacked a publisher, we can only assume Independent Arts failed to find anyone to fund the game further, and Demon Hunter remained unreleased. We've already mentioned Raylight Studios, but they had another impressive title planned for the GBA called GB Rally 2 Advance, a 3D driving game with very impressive features. Not only were its cars animated at all angles, they could have visual damage at angles as well. The title would have had 8 cars and 42 tracks at 14 different locations. Each track was also fully 3D, with climbs and descents, rather than being Mode 7 inspired like other racers on GBA. The title also had 5 different game modes, including multiplayer, which supported up to 4 players. Despite being called GB Rally 2 Advance, this is actually the 3rd GB Rally game Raylight announced, and amazingly, none of them saw release. It's believed the publishers simply weren't interested in the property. Another scrapped racer was GP Advance, an F1 racing game by the Italian studio Prograph Research. Prograph had developed a game engine for the GBA called DR Advance in 2003, which allowed for dozens of polygons on screen at a reasonable frame rate. To show what the engine could do, Prograph decided to make the GP Advance demo, but as Unseen64 reported, the profit margins publishers offered were too low to justify full development. GP Advance never saw release, and the DR Advance engine was never used in a retail title. Another racer that met an unfortunate end was Extreme G, a futuristic title by Probe Entertainment for the N64. The series had 4 entries across 6 years, but the 3rd game didn't release on every platform it was intended to. Developers Similis were working on a downgraded GBA version of Extreme G3 to go along with the GameCube and PS2 versions. The title wasn't true 3D, and as such was able to run at an impressive 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, this build didn't get very far before it was scrapped, having only a month of development. While some games never get off the ground, others are so doomed they actually get cancelled twice. A title based on the acclaimed DC series 100 Bullets had 2 attempts at a game. The first was being made for home consoles and was in the works at Acclaim. Aiming for an October 2004 release, the title was canned after Acclaim filed for bankruptcy earlier in September. Publisher D3 took a crack at the IP and announced a 100 Bullets game of their own for several home consoles, plus versions for DS and Advance. Aside from this announcement, not much is known about D3's project or what the GBA version might have looked like. We have a pretty good idea what some other cancelled titles look like, partly because they got so far into production they were actually listed on Amazon. Made by Sapphire and published by Titus Interactive, Barbarian was a 3D arena fighter for 6th generation consoles. Before it was announced for all major consoles, it was first unveiled as a GBA game in June 2001, alongside a PS2 version. The GBA title was set to have 6 different modes, including a training mode, quest, survival, and extreme survival. Multiplayer was also on the table, and the initial announcement said 2 players were supported with the link cable, though this was later bumped up to 4. The original Barbarian on Amiga had a decapitation move, which would appear in the Advance game through a cheat code. Titus was set to release Barbarian in the US and Europe in October 2002, and although PS2, GameCube, and Xbox versions all released, the GBA version was left in limbo. Speaking of Amiga games, published by Vulcan Software and in the works at Magic Birds, Desolate World was a side-scrolling action game that began life on the Amiga. It appeared in several magazines during the late 90s, though this version never came to pass. Sometime later it was repurposed for Game Boy Advance, but that build also bit the dust. In 2013, demo footage of the GBA game surfaced online, and in 2017, a demo of the Amiga version was discovered as well. Crawfish was also in charge of bringing a trio of Amiga titles made by the Bitmap brothers in the early 90s. These games were reinventions of Gods, Chaos Engine, and Magic Pockets. Crawfish were huge fans of the original games, and the folks at Bitmap trusted them to reimagine their old titles for a new audience. No concrete reason was given as to why these games never made it to market. These weren't the only retro titles being brought to the system. In June 2002, Metro 3D Inc. announced Aero the Acrobat would be hitting GBA with a port of the original 1993 game, which was released later that month. The studio expected the sequel to appear on the handheld in the future, alongside the game's spin-off Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel. Unfortunately for fans of old-school platformers, neither Aero the Acrobat 2 nor Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel made it to the system. Checkered Flag was another 90s title planned to get a GBA release. This Atari Lynx racing game was planned to be ported to GBA alongside ports of V-Rally and Stuntman within a compilation. On June 23, 2005, a 2-in-1 pack featuring Stuntman and V-Rally 3 was released exclusively in Europe, but Checkered Flag never reached the finish finish line. Rick Dangerous Advance was yet another canned port of a classic title. Rick Dangerous was originally released on various home computers in 1989 and 1990, but the group's Spoutnik team planned to bring it to GBA as well in the early 2000s. On December 3, 2003, the team had some disappointing news to share. They'd received a notice saying the rights holders to Rick Dangerous were unwilling to sell the license for internal reasons. At that point, the team was legally unable to keep working on the title, and production was halted. They hoped the reasoning was due to a possible Rick game in development, but nothing's been done with the IP since. Another canned title was Haven, Call of the King. Planned to be published by Midway and developed by Traveler's Tales, Haven was an action-adventure title released on the PS2 in 2002. There were plans for it to be released on Xbox and GameCube, and of course on GBA. While the console game used 3D graphics, the dev team felt the handheld could be used to showcase their 2D expertise, and promised an experience on par with its console counterpart. When Call of the King launched on PS2, it received mixed reviews and was deemed a commercial failure. Not only did all future ports get the axe, but 2 proposed follow-ups bit the dust as well. Broken Circle was an RPG based on Nordic mythology set to release on GBA. Originally, the game was so massive it would have needed a 256 megabit cartridge, which was an expensive and unattractive proposition for publishers. Because of this, no publishers were interested until Seven Raven managed to crunch the game down to just 64 megabits. By this time, however, the ship had sailed for the GBA, and the only publisher interested in the title wasn't even approved by Nintendo. All wasn't lost, however. In 2009, Seven Raven released the game's ROM on their website for all to enjoy. The 2D side-scroller Eternity's Child came out on mobile phones in the mid-2000s. The game's creator Luke Bernard was aiming to bring the franchise to several consoles, including GBA, though at the same time, Bernard was also working on a WiiWare version of the game, alongside a sequel titled Eternity's Child 2, Retro Child. Ultimately, the game only ever released on Steam, with all other versions cancelled, and the PC game was very different to footage of the GBA build. Eternity's Child's development also had a member worth noting. Did you know gaming creator Shane Gill served as an artist and level designer during his time on the team, and even worked on the advanced version as well? From what Shane recalls, the GBA release was more in line with the original mobile title. Mythry was a Final Fantasy-inspired RPG, and a labor of love by the indie group Team Excalibur. The group became a licensed developer for Nintendo in fall of 1998, and soon got to work on Mythry. To gauge interest in a JRPG for the console, the team launched a petition which got over 4,000 signatures and caught the eye of a few publishers, though it would be another few years before one of them bit. During this wait, the game moved from the Game Boy Color over to the Advance. It was then newly formed publisher Variant Interactive showed interest in funding the project, but unfortunately, this funding never came about. Soon after, the Excalibur team went their separate ways, but in 2016, one of the devs, Tom Hullett, shared much of the game's art, music, as well as the game's prototype online. This wasn't the only GBA title to get its prototype leaked online. Space Pirate Captain Harlock was a manga series by Leiji Matsumoto, starting in 1977, and was popularized in 1978 with a TV series. The character of Captain Harlock has appeared in several pieces of media since, but there's only one place they never ventured. In 2016, a GBA ROM of a non-interactive Captain Harlock prototype was released online by Unseen64. The prototype was an RPG based on the titular IP, reflecting the style of the TV show that popularized the series. Unfortunately, not much is known about the project or why it was cancelled. Another nixed RPG is Project Alpha, which was in development for the Advance by Multimedia Intelligence Transfer, best known for games such as Devil Children, Demi Kids, and Megami Tensei Gaiden. This unnamed title was being developed using the same engine as the Devil Children titles, and reused many assets from Devil Children Firebook, which were likely temporary. A build of the game leaked that was extremely early in development, and we're not entirely sure why it was scrapped. That said, MIT seems to have stopped producing games as of 2003. In May 2002, Majesco announced an extreme sports title called Rolling, in the works at Rage Software and set for release on Xbox, GameCube, and GBA. The publisher listed several features like 14 different skate courses, over 18 different skaters, and lots of customization options. IGN noted that all features listed probably won't show up on the Advance, as the team were focused on console versions. The title was scheduled for release that fall, but all versions of Rolling ended up on the chopping block. Another unpublished sports game for the GBA was High Heat Major League Baseball 2004, the last in a series of baseball titles published by the 3DO company before they struck out. While the console versions were being made by Team 366, an advanced version was in the works at Mobius Entertainment, and would have been their third consecutive High Heat game on the console. It was announced for late 2002 and set for a spring 2003 release, alongside a port for the GameCube. The PS2, Xbox, and PC builds hit the field in February February and March, and the Nintendo versions were both finished as well, but in May 2003, 3DO filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and scrapped these ports. Later that August, Microsoft bought the rights to High Heat, but nothing's been done with the series since then. Yet another scrapped sports title on the system was a pool game known as Hardcore Pool, announced by publisher Telegames at E3 2003. The title boasted 3D rendered graphics and realistic ball and table physics. There were 8 playable characters, 8 different pool tables, and 5 modes. Nintendo had the game listed in a holiday lineup for 2004, and it was projected to come out that December, but this game wasn't meant to be. Despite getting a box art, the project was canned. The team at Game Titan had a tennis game in the works for the Advance called Superstar Tennis. First announced on May 10, 2004, the title had a roster of 8 characters, all of which were licensed creations of artist Kenneth Fager. Each character had a court to call their own, and as you'd expect from this type of game, there were super moves, a tournament mode, and multiplayer. Sonari Interactive was also making a tennis title on the system called World Tour Tennis at some point, though save for some screenshots, there's not much else to say about it other than it was axed. We've previously talked about World Reborn and its canned DS title on this channel, but the GBA precursor also ran into its fair share of problems. On October 3, 2003, DSi Games announced they were publishing the title, and it was expected to ship in early 2004. In 2008, one of the game's developers explained some of the goings-on behind the scenes. The first publisher they contacted liked the early demo and got the team officially licensed for the Advance. That publisher soon underwent a corporate restructuring, and Neopong's contract got lost in the ether. The deal they were offered wasn't the greatest, but they eventually found luck with another publisher, and were soon approved for Nintendo's future handhelds. A few other publishers expressed interest in World Reborn, but it, along with a proposed DS iteration, never saw an official release. Since then, the game's ROM has been made freely available for download. Chronicles of Eden Volume 1, Vanguard's Tale, was another canned GBA title, this time spearheaded by Lightspire Studios. Announced in 2004, it was described as an RPG, but studio co-founder Matt Roberts likened it to a story-driven action-adventure title. In an interview with PlanetGameBoy.de, he said the studio chose to make GBA games as it fit their general design, and was less expensive than consoles, being the best option for 2D titles. The game had 4 individual episodes, each one taking around 4 to 6 hours to beat for the average player. The project started out with 3 playable characters, with an unlockable 4th as the player progressed. All the title's dungeons would be unified, and Roberts believed their team had the most advanced dialogue engine of any handheld game at that point. Multiplayer wasn't on the cards, though there were plans to trade items between cartridges. When asked about a launch date, Roberts said they needed to find a publisher before anything was set in stone. As the game's visuals were inspired by a German town, he hoped it'd see release there as well. Sadly, this ambitious project wasn't released anywhere. The GBA was also set to get a few ports of popular mobile titles from the early 2000s, such as Diner Dash. Developed by Play First, work on this port started in early 2006 alongside versions for Nintendo DS and PSP. Builds of the title were already running by August that year, though by January 2007, the Advance version was left on the chopping block. Footage of this port shows it would have been similar to the other handhelds, though with less features and a lower resolution. Another scrapped mobile game on the console was actually headed by id Software co-founder John Romero. His team at Monkey Stone Games released the title Hyperspace Delivery Boy for the Pocket PC in December 2001, and it was later ported to Windows and Linux. In July 2002, Majesco announced they'd be publisher for a GBA port, set for release that fall, but the date came and went, with no such port in sight. XSIV Games was making a follow-up to the 1995 shoot-'em-up Tyrion, called Tyrion 2000. Originally published by Symmetry Entertainment and later Stealth Productions, versions were being made for both the Advance and Game Boy Color. As development went on, the Color version was axed in favor of the GBA game, but both ended up meeting the same fate. But in a miraculous twist, both of their ROMs were dumped online in 2004 by World Tree Games, a studio made up of Symmetry Entertainment alumni. The Color version somewhat resembles a finished product, but the Advance build is very much incomplete. In 2004, Puppy Bomb Games were developing a side-scrolling action title for the GBA called Pocket Mechs. Not much is known about this title other than it would involve both alien and Earth-based mechs, which were presumably pocket-sized. The project never surfaced, with Unseen 64 speculating the project may have never found a publisher to back it. Speaking of publishers, publishing issues, 7th Sense Studios had 2 games in development based on the works of comic strip writer Lee Falk. These titles were Mandrake, The Shadow of the Vem, and The Phantom, The Ghost Who Walks. Publisher Microids acquired the rights to both characters from King Features Syndicate Inc. in late 2002, and the games were expected to ship at the end of 2003. Both titles had an isometric view and ran on the same engine, though with differences in gameplay to suit the characters. In August of 2016, the website Chronicle Chamber got in contact with one of 7th Sense co-founders, Sebastiano Mandala, and he shared a trove of info about the Italian studio's work on both games. They'd worked with Microids on a few Game Boy Color titles in the past, and development on Mandrake and Phantom took about 8 months. While the 7th Sense was barely familiar with the franchise, King Features sent over a lot of reference material to lend a hand. Things were progressing smoothly up until the final stretch, when Microids declared bankruptcy, and unfortunately took 7th Sense down with it. Still, ROMs for these games have found their way online, and Mandala has shared design docs, sketches, and more for everyone to see. Another game stunted by publisher mishaps was Iridium Advance. The UK studio Tin Tiger was formed by 3 X-Rage software staff, and through their connections were offered to make a GBA version of the Commodore shoot-'em-up Iridium. One of the project leads, John McMurray, expanded on ideas they had in the August 2020 issue of Retro Gamer magazine. For Iridium Advance, they wanted to emphasize speed as a gameplay factor, and have a difficulty curve that wasn't as tough and unfair as the original. The title was finished and received Nintendo's approval, alongside Paradroid, a remake of another Commodore shoot-'em-up. The games were going to be released together on a single cartridge to justify the price, but of course there was trouble ahead. They were set for a 2002 release, but the publisher Gesture Interactive went belly up around that time. Paradroid wasn't quite finished, and since they were supposed to come out as a 2-in-1, Paradroid brought Iridium down with it. During development of the 2005 Xbox platformer Torque, a GBA version was in the works at Studio Realism, who you might know as the team behind Super Monkey Ball Jr. In January 2004, the studio outlined some of the game's features. The handheld version had 3 different gameplay styles, each one showcasing the studio's tech on the Advance. Some levels incorporated Mode 7, and would have the player riding on the back of a T-Rex. More info about the title was unveiled in December of 2020, when the website Games That Weren't got in contact with Realism staff, who shared a few extra tidbits. At one point, the GBA version overtook development of the Xbox game. The project was 60% complete before an overhaul of publisher THQ, after which the port was dropped. Sometime in 2003, the European studio Engine Software announced Cyanide, a shoot-'em-up that was making its way to the handheld for 2004, and like Torque, was being made in tandem with an Xbox version. The GBA game was said to have 6 levels of space shooting action, with weapons that could fire in multiple directions. The title was to be published in Europe by PlayLogic, though there was no word of a US release. And again, much like Torque, Cyanide showed up on Xbox, with the Advance port left in the dust. French studio Small Rockets had several games in the works for the GBA, the first of which was called 4x4 Off-Roaders. Announced in May 2001, the title made use of a homemade voxel engine. In an October 2019 interview with GamingAlexandria.com, project lead Marcus Lynn said he made the engine in his spare time and later showed it to his friends at the studio, who created a demo with it and showed it off online. The game went through several publishers and took on a few forms before being shelved, but some of Lynn's tech was put to use in the GBA port of Sean Murray's Wakeboarding Unleashed. Come 2003, the team was also making a port of Travis Pastrana's Pro Moto X, which was later released as MTX Moto Tracks on PS2 and Xbox in 2004. It apparently got quite far along before getting shelved, but ROMs for both these games have been shared online. Another racer that didn't get far was GTS Racing Challenge, in the works at Astroware and Pizzazz Games. The title saw a release on devices like the Pocket PC, but an Advance port was on the table at some point. Games archivist Andrew Borman shared footage of the title and cited the prototype as extremely bare bones. It's thought the demo was made to test the waters on the Advance, though it's not clear if it was actually planned to release on the system. There were more axed racers on the GBA. Bonks Racing was made by Planet Interactive with Ubisoft as publisher. Announced in August 2001, the game had players control a cube, sliding along the ground and climbing staircases to move ahead. As time went on, more puzzles would be added to the mix, and various power-ups would become usable as well. The game also had a multiplayer aspect, with several modes letting you face up to 4 friends. Some of these included a standard race mode, one in the vein of Frogger where cubes race through traffic, and a King of the Hill mode where players defend their turf from enemies. It had a planned release for October 2001, but it was sadly sadly a no-show. Another racing title that failed to cross the finish line was US Racer. Players could choose from 6 different vehicles in the game and race through 8 tracks across America, from locations like New York and LA to Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. US enforcement would be hot on your tail as well, ranging from local sheriffs to the FBI. It was quoted as the ultimate race through the USA, though it seems like it didn't get very far along. Nintendo themselves has had a long history with the sport of horse racing, and in 2001 were making a horse racing simulator called Baketsu Daisuken, or Horse Racing Creation Derby. The game had 3 known modes: a racing mode where you played as the jockey, a betting mode that showed stats and figures of horses and tracks throughout a season, and an RPG breeding mode. Horse racing is fairly popular in Japan, but less so in other territories, and a January 2001 article from IGN poked fun at the limited audience the game had, saying, "At this point, you either are saying to yourself, 'Yep, that's the one I have no interest in,' or just a simple, 'Huh?' The title was planned to use the Game Boy's mobile adapter, which never released outside Japan, and most of the titles that supported it were Japan exclusive as well. All this likely led to the game being canned. But another scrap GBA racer certainly would have had a wide appeal. In June 2002, news broke of Universal Interactive obtaining the Fast and Furious license. They planned games for the PS2, Xbox, and GBA, all set for release in 2003. Surprisingly, no version of Fast and Furious came out, and little else is known about how the GBA game would have fared. Not much is known about this next game either, but it at least has a single screenshot for us to go on. And from what we can tell, Radio Rayless was a futuristic racing game being made around 2002 by Now Production. Other than that, nothing else is really known. GP1 Racing was an overhead racer created and published by Edge Interact sometime in 2003. The GBA had some cancelled oddball titles as well. Black Rodeo was in the works at Cave Barn sometime in 2002. According to an article from IGN at the time, it seemed to be running on the same engine as Urban Yeti, which Cave Barn had put out that August. Other than a few screenshots, info on this game is practically non-existent at this time. In 2001, Thalamus Interactive had a port of Sanxion in the works for GBA. It said the updated game would have had new features like a 2-player mode, but was apparently cancelled for being too much of a financial gamble. Talos Interactive created a 3D engine for the system known as Delta Advance Engine, and it was apparently going to be used for a game called Destiny. No publisher was attached to this project, and we found no other information about it online, so our guess as to why it was cancelled is as good as anyone else's. Math Patrol: The Venus Virus was a follow-up to 2007's The Kleptoid Threat, developed by GXB Interactive and published by Tommy. This was an edutainment title, apparently slated for a 2008 release before being axed. A far less kid-friendly game was also scrapped. In March 2004, an EB Games listing announced a sequel to Def Jam Vendetta, which was eventually published as Def Jam Fight for New York. In this listing, a GBA version was listed alongside the console games, and was the only version not to see a release. Did you know? Sonic Advance was one of the first projects Sega considered after the discontinuation of the Dreamcast. In January 2001, Sega of Japan issued a press release stating that they were restructuring the company. They specified that they were in negotiations with Sony and Nintendo, who until very recently were Sega's fiercest competitors. The negotiations were over the creation of software for the PlayStation 2 and Game Boy Advance. And at the end of the month, Sega revealed one of the titles they discussed would be Sonic the Hedgehog Advance. Although Sonic Advance would be the first Sonic game on a Nintendo console, it was not Sonic's first game on a third-party system. Sonic Jam had been ported to the Tiger Gamecom in 1997, and Sonic Pocket Adventure was released for the Neo Geo Pocket Color in 1999. Sonic Pocket Adventure was developed as a joint effort between Sonic Team and SNK. The game was staffed by the likes of Takeshi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto, who were the director and designer for the original Street Fighter, respectively. Nishiyama left SNK soon after to create DIMPS, the company that would produce the Sonic Advance series. He was joined at DIMPS by Matsumoto, who'd go on to become the producer on Sonic Advance 1 and 2. Series creator Yuji Naka found his return to creating 2D games refreshing, especially after developing 3D games for so long. He often wondered what it'd be like to make a Sonic game for Nintendo hardware, and felt that a Sonic game made for a Nintendo console would be very different in tone and style to the one made for a Sega console. Naka understood the importance of a company's identity, quality, and felt that a Sonic game made for a Nintendo console would be very different in tone and style to one made for a Sega console. Sega had always presented themselves as being more high-tech than Nintendo, and as such had an easier time marketing towards an older audience. Nintendo, on the other hand, always had an easier time appealing to children thanks to their toy box approach to game development. Sega and Nintendo also had vastly different approaches to quality control. While Sonic Team had only spent a couple weeks tweaking and balancing their titles before release, Nintendo were a lot more meticulous. Naka was also interested in the connectivity between the GameCube and the GBA, and was eager to include the feature in Sonic Advance. The Chow Garden presented the perfect opportunity to use the technology. In the Dreamcast version of Sonic Adventure 2, players could download Chow into the Dreamcast's visual memory unit to interact with it on the move. But in the GameCube remake, the player could instead download their Chow into Sonic Advance's tiny Chow Garden. The GBA's greater processing power allowed for more advanced Chow interaction on the go. Naka's enthusiasm for the system actually spurred on Nintendo's teams to make better use of it. The Chow Garden is also linked to a notable glitch that contributed to a second version of the game being released. If the player deletes their save file in the game, they'll be prevented from transferring new rings they collect to the Chow Garden. This is because deleting the main save file doesn't remove the ring count data from the Chow Garden, and if the ring count in the main game and the garden aren't synced, the rings won't transfer. This can only be fixed by collecting the exact same amount of rings as the player had before, or by using hacking devices like GameShark. The glitch was fixed in the Japan-exclusive version 1.1 release, and is said to be fixed in the English Combo Pack releases. Sonic Advance was also released as Sonic N for the Nokia N-Gage handheld in 2003. This version of the game was largely criticized for its lack of a Chow Garden, slower speed, and inferior audio and visual quality. The N-Gage's screen was taller than it was wide, making the game near impossible to play in its portrait mode, as players couldn't see approaching enemies or objects. To compensate for this, Sega added an option to play with a 4:3 landscape aspect ratio. However, this scaled the sprites down without any filtering, causing loss of detail and a grainy finish. This version of the game also never released in Japan. Sonic Advance's opening stage, Neo Green Hill Zone, is possibly a reference to a scrapped level name from Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on Sega Genesis. The Aquatic Ruin Zone was called Neo Green Hill Zone in an earlier version of the game. However, this isn't conclusive. Many zones in Sonic Advance share similarities with zones from Sonic Pocket Adventure, and Neo Green Hill Zone may be inspired by the first level, Neo South Island Zone. South Island is the setting for the original Sonic the Hedgehog, meaning that Green Hill is located there. Casino Paradise Zone also contains a few secrets. The castle in the zone's background bears a strong resemblance to the Magic Kingdom at Disney World, and is even lit the same way the Magic Kingdom is at night. As well as being a clear nod to Sonic 2's Casino Night Zone, a platform similar to the Barrel of Doom from Sonic 3's Carnival Night Zone also appears in Act 2. A welcome sign at the start of the level may also be a reference to the Sonic the Hedgehog prototype, where there was a welcome sign in Green Hill Zone. Sonic Advance 2 was conceived immediately after the completion of the first game on GBA, and work began in February of 2002. The speed of the game was increased so much from Sonic Advance that the levels had to be made around 6 times larger to compensate. Sonic Advance 2 was Cream the Rabbit's first playable appearance in a video game. She was originally created to fill the role of Team Rose's flying character in Sonic Heroes, but ended up making her debut in Sonic Advance 2, a whole year before Heroes released. She was added to the sequel to distinguish it more from the first Advance title. Sega also wanted her to debut in a game before she appeared in the upcoming Sonic X anime series. Technically, Cream's first appearance in a game was even earlier, in the Sonic Mega Collection Extras menu. The character went through a few incarnations as a squirrel and a raccoon before the rabbit design was settled on. She was designed to be easy for beginners to play. Her Chow Cheese will home in on the enemies to deal damage, allowing Cream to stay out of danger as she does so. She attacks this way because Yuji Naka felt that it damaged the character's cute image if she attacked enemies by herself. Advance 2's Music Plant Zone may be inspired by a similar area from a previous Sonic Team game, Ristar's Planet Sonata. Sonic and Ristar even share very similar poses and animations when they're launched off a spring in these levels. Sonic Mega Collection also showcased a trailer for Sonic Advance 2 that featured music not heard anywhere in the game. Sonic Advance 2 also features a track that went unused in the first game's data. The track seems to be an alternate invincibility theme and replaced the traditional invincibility tune in both Sonic Advance 2 and 3. The 2011 Android port of Sonic Advance also uses a different invincibility tune that's a remix of the game's title theme, and several other tracks were swapped out for new music, including the tracks for the X-Zone fights. Interestingly, all the replaced GBA tunes were remixes of tracks from Sonic 1 and 2 on Genesis. These alterations may be linked to a larger issue with Sonic, Sega, and composer Masato Nakamura. The tracks Nakamura made for Sonic 1 and 2, and even remixes of the music, are rarely used in modern Sonic games. It's speculated that this is because Nakamura owns the copyright to these tracks himself, and Sega must pay him royalties whenever they're used. Sonic Advance 3 was the final game in the Sonic series to feature the original voice cast that debuted in Sonic Adventure. From Shadow the Hedgehog onwards, they were replaced by the 4Kids cast that dubbed Sonic X. The game also marked the last time Eggman's voice actor, Dean Bristow, would record new lines for the character before he passed on. Dedicated Sonic fans assume that Bristow's passing is what made Sega replace the existing voice lineup with the Sonic X cast, but this isn't the case. In 2008, Sonic fan site SonicScene.net interviewed Eggman's current voice actor, Mike Pollock. Pollock revealed in the interview that the choice to replace the Sonic Adventure cast with Sonic X's was made before Bristow passed away. Pollock said it was strictly a business decision, which also lines up with statements from Simon Jeffrey, who was president of Sega of America from 2005 to 2009. Jeffrey told SonicStadium.org, "Sega of America are a subsidiary of Sega of Japan. They reside in Japan and do not come under my jurisdiction at all. Likewise, I know this will make you all mad, Sega of America has no say in the voice casting. Absolutely none." One thing that set Sonic Advance 3 apart from the first two games was its use of teams, and according to an interview with IGN, it was Yuji Naka who conceived this partner system. It wasn't the first time in the Advance series that players could use two characters at once, however. By using a cheat code on the original Sonic Advance's character select screen, it's possible to play as Sonic with Tails following him, like in Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic Advance 3 was planned internally at Sonic Team, but was again exported to DIMPS because of a lack of staff and resources at Sega. The Sonic Advance series contains a number of musical references to other games in the series. The Invincibility jingle in the first Sonic Advance is a remix of the Invincibility jingle in Sonic 1 and 2. Ice Paradise remixes the minigame music from Sonic Advance's Tiny Chow Garden. Sunset Hill Zone from Sonic Advance 3 is a remix of Green Hill Zone from the original Sonic the Hedgehog, but it also takes its drum samples from Sonic Battle's Central City theme. Similarly, parts of Route 99 were remixed from Tails' Lab from Sonic Battle. Alter Emerald remixes Holy Summit, and the Secret Level Non-Aggression remixes E1215's theme from Sonic Battle. Sonic Battle is perhaps referenced so often in Sonic Advance 3's music because of the nature of its villain. G-Merle is based on Emerald, the copy robot that was a key character in Sonic Battle. Route 99 was referenced in issue 175 of Sonic the Comic, published in February 2000, 4 years before Sonic Advance 3 was released. As Sega had little to do with the production of a British licensed tie-in, this was most likely a coincidence.
The Game Boy Advance was amazing. It was a great step forward for all of us who enjoyed gaming on the go, with top-notch titles like Metroid Fusion, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, and Golden Sun. But for as advanced as a portable gaming system could get, some of its games had a fair few mistakes. And when we highlight these mistakes, we aren't trying to comment on the quality of the entertainment that comes from any of these games. This is just a fun look at some errors that made their way into games on one of Nintendo's best handhelds. This includes titles that remain the gold standard to this day, save for a few mistakes we're about to mention, such as Pokemon Emerald, Mega Man Battle Network, Digimon Battle Spirit, and even the Japanese exclusive Mother 3. Each of these games demonstrated that there's no reason to dismiss 2D as a viable option for creating engrossing experiences, even if those experiences take place on a 240 by 160 pixel screen. We'll be talking about these titles and a few more in this episode, but let's start off with a popular GBA Dragon Ball Z title. While it's considered to be quite a popular game among Dragon Ball fans, that doesn't stop mistakes cropping up in the GBA RPG Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku. As a result of the game's somewhat rocky development, it's unsurprising that there were a few issues with the game. One of these involves the player's movement. If the player is hit by a ki blast whilst they are in flight mode, they should be pushed out of flight mode. But in doing so, the flight counter will still be visible on screen. And not just that, but the player becomes invincible, only losing this power when they enter a different location. This, as you might imagine, leads to some parts of the game becoming incredibly trivial. Another mistake to do with locations occurs in the northwest section of the map, where the Ginyu Force reside. It's possible in this area to actually skip this segment entirely, as a result of a misplaced warp in this corner. This was very likely a mistake from the game's developers, as you're supposed to fight the Ginyu Force to progress the story, and the warp isn't even on land. But when it comes to the fourth entry in a series where every precious release has been translated into English with at least decent accuracy, you might expect better with this next title. Mega Man Battle Network 4, Red Sun and Blue Moon are now infamous for their lack of polish when it comes to their in-game dialogue, not just because of its wide array of grammatical errors, but also due to a good number of obvious spelling mistakes. Throughout the game, characters will refer to multiple viruses as a viruses or viruses is instead of a virus or viruses are. There are low-level mistakes as well, such as casually mixing up 2 and 2, or simply spell-checking mistakes for words, with a huge variety of single-letter mistakes like, "It looks live we've been kidnapped," and "loosing the dark chip and shade men." Of course, along with these are lines which are just poorly translated in multiple ways, like, "Mega Man, is the jack out now?" But with a huge library of games, Mega Man Battle Network 4 isn't the only game on the GBA to have some issues with its translation. Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town is considered to be one of the best in the series, but even this game has some problems with its English language section. At one point in the game, the player is given the opportunity to tell NPCs about a job at a winery. When speaking with the town's priest, Carter, the opportunity to tell him about the job is somewhat obscured, as the options to tell him will be written in German for some reason. These choices, when translated, are tell about the job or don't tell. If the player decides to let Carter know about the job, he will even respond in German as well, which when translated reads, "A part-time job at the winery sounds like a lot of fun." But since this is an English version of the game, this is less than ideal. Next up, let's talk about Fire Emblem. This GBA Fire Emblem entry decided that for its North American release, it would drop its subtitle, The Blazing Blade, likely as a way of not intimidating new players who weren't accustomed to the franchise. At this point, Fire Emblem was almost entirely known in the Western world due to Marth and Roy's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Melee, which was one reason this title even saw an English release at all. Being released after The Binding Blade, a Japanese exclusive GBA release, you'd assume that this game would have made improvements over their earlier entry, but there were clearly some mistakes during its development. One of these mistakes occurs with the ballista weapon used by archers, which usually has the game display no animation for their attacks, despite the fact that there is animation for the archers using the ballista in the game's data. Why these animations weren't used is unknown. This is a particularly confusing aspect of unused data, as they'd already been used in Sword of Seals, but they were either cut or forgotten. Another error occurs in this entry of Fire Emblem. The previous game in the series revealed that Volt is actually the son of Rebecca, but since The Blazing Blade is a prequel, it's possible to create a paradox. Rebecca is a playable character in Blazing Blade, and it's possible for her health to reach 0 and thus be subject to permadeath, preventing Volt from ever being born. Perhaps this is a bit nitpicky, but it's likely just an oversight by the Fire Emblem team, as if they had considered this, they would either have likely flagged Rebecca as being unable to be dealt permadeath in the previous game, or would have given Volt a different mother. We mentioned that Fire Emblem on the GBA was the first in the series to be localized into English, so some mistakes are to be expected. This next piece of trivia has been mentioned on this channel many years ago, but we wanted to include it to increase its posterity and raise awareness of just how great a man Stuart Gilray was. Pinball Challenge Deluxe was a simple port of two earlier pinball games for the Amiga, Pinball Dreams and Pinball Fantasies, two beloved pinball titles still considered to be the crowning jewel of their generation. According to the late and great Stuart Gilray, who worked as the director of development at the time of the game's releases, hardware issues sprang up which were out of the development team's control upon publication. The game fails to save any data at all when it's turned off, despite the fact that the team had included a save feature in the game's code. Gilray explained, "We created the game to allow saves, etc. But for some reason, I'm guessing budgetary, Ubisoft at the last minute decided to not manufacture the game with EEPROM save memory." Stuart Gilray also went on to state that saving the game does work when using a flash cart or if the game is played through emulation, and that he would encourage people that play it to play it on a backup cart just so to allow saving. Rest in peace, Stuart, you were a real one. Some mistakes in games aren't so detrimental to the player, and really, you could probably just ignore them or not even notice them at all. This is the case for a mistake that shows up in Digimon Battle Spirit. The game is undoubtedly a very well produced love letter to the Digimon series, and is also a port of an earlier game released exclusively in Japan for the Wonder Swan. But this doesn't mean that the team didn't make some mistakes along the way. The game's final boss, Millenniumon, is incorrectly depicted in-game as having 2 red fingers, despite official artwork showing him as only having 1 on the top of his left hand. This wasn't a new mistake introduced to the GBA, but also appeared in the earlier release, but apparently the devs failed to spot it a second time when bringing it to the Nintendo handheld. So far we've mentioned a lot of translations and Japanese exclusives, but this next piece is about a game which never received an official translation and has always remained in Japan. Save for a very high quality fan translation, of course, it's Mother 3. It is in this instance that a mistake simply led to a fun little Easter egg. In Chapter 7, when a hooded Mr. Saturn gives the player back the Courage badge, Mr. Saturn says goodbye to the player and walks a few spaces off screen where it is supposed to stop and disappear. However, due to a bug, he will remain in that spot, just a few spaces away from the player. Itoi revealed in an interview that he actually liked this bug, so he decided to keep it there and write some text for him, because he's not a bug, he's a feature. Another popular Game Boy Advance RPG is, and you probably guessed this one by now, it's Pokemon. And this time, we're looking at Emerald Edition. This mistake is a bit of a doozy, one which really can ruin your day, but in all likelihood will never happen unless you go out of your way to do it to yourself. Through taking a series of complex and absurd steps as demonstrated by YouTuber Pika's Prey, it's possible to cause the game to completely softlock. By performing these steps, the game will essentially force the player into a situation where they have no money or resources, and no means of acquiring more money or mons. And with only one Pokemon, a level 100 Electrode that only knows a single move, Self-Destruct. If this is done correctly, then the player can find themselves stuck at the Pokemon League building, unable to progress and unable to retreat. This softlock is not possible to recreate in the Generation 6 remakes released on the 3DS, however, not that it would be much consolation if you managed to get yourself stuck on the GBA title.
Hello, and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today we're looking at interesting and exciting uses of console hardware. Pushing a console to its limits is something many game developers strive to do. With the Game Boy Advance being a primarily 2D gaming handheld, the desire to push the device and create 3D games was an understandable one. Raylight Games, an Italian studio, was one of the more prominent 3D developers for the GBA, and created their own 3D engine for the handheld with impressive results. They created 2 demos showing the rendering capabilities of their Blue Roses engine, one by recreating a similar area to the hangar from Metal Gear Solid, and another of a playable demo for Resident Evil 2. This Resident Evil demo put players in control of Leon during the opening moments of the full original PlayStation release. The demo also includes a small, non-playable snippet showing a shot from Street Fighter X after completion. While none of the games were finished or officially endorsed by their original rights holders, these demos were created to show off the light footprint and power of Raylight's Blue Roses engine. Raylight tried to pitch the game to Capcom officially, but it was turned down, in part because the Game Boy Advance was ending its relevancy, but also because Capcom saw issue with a mature game for the system. Hello, and welcome to Region Locked. Nintendo is praised for the many different genres in which it's willing to feature its eponymous Mario. Not only has Mario starred in a variety of popular games ranging from platformers, sports games and educational titles, to puzzle games, shooters, and fighting games. One of the most popular being the variety of Mario RPGs. Fans of Super Mario RPG, developed by Squaresoft for the SNES and published by Nintendo in 1996, had to wait some time for a new Mario RPG title. The next RPG focusing on the mustachioed pipefitter was Paper Mario in the year 2000, having Mario take on a new form and appearance. The next RPG which concentrated on the classic form of the character would be Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga in 2003, often considered the true successor to Square's earlier take on a Mario RPG. However, prior to Superstar Saga's release, developers Alpha Dream had created another game which perhaps acted as the catalyst to Mario's return to the role-playing realm of turn-based mechanics. That game, which was aimed primarily at a younger audience, is Tomato Adventure. Tomato Adventure was developed by Alpha Dream and published by Nintendo in early 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, exclusively to a Japanese audience. The player takes on the role of Demille, an anthropomorphic hare-like character. The game's setting is a land known as the Ketchup Kingdom, under the reign of the tomato fanatic ruler, King Abira. Demille has been shunned from society and banished to spend his days in the cliffside Kobori village, being exiled, as with the rest of the villagers, because of their distaste for tomatoes. When the national holiday Tomato Day rolls around, Demille is watching TV when an announcement is made, revealing that a machine has been completed called the Super Kara Cooker. According to King Abira, this machine would allow for the citizens of the Ketchup Kingdom to remain as children forever. As Tomato Day is a special occasion, Demille is given the opportunity to fight for the chance to leave the village in which he is being confined, just for the day. After winning this right, he explores the nearby toy ruins with his girlfriend Passaran. During their tour of the ruins, the couple are kidnapped by two purple creatures called Boriki and Goriki, who escape in an airship. They drop Demille out of the ship, setting his adventure in motion as he sallies forth to rescue his girlfriend. Passaran is taken to the Gimmick Palace, where King Abira reveals his plans to use her energy to charge the Super Kara Cooker. Not only that, but it's revealed that the Super Kara Cooker is not a machine intended to keep the entire kingdom young, but instead it will be used to turn the inhabitants into toys. Demille must adventure through the world, taking out the 6 super kids, collecting 6 toy parts along the way to grant him access to the Gimmick Palace, so that he can save his girlfriend, prevent the Super Kara Cooker from being activated, and defeat the king. On his quest to save the Tomato Village, Demille is joined by other characters who assist him on his journey. They must battle with enemies using a variety of toy-like weapons called gimmicks. Each gimmick attack is unique in how it's carried out, similar to the Special Bros attacks within Mario and Luigi. These fall into 4 categories. Time gimmicks, requiring the player to press a button with the correct timing, render gimmicks, involving hitting the same button multiple times, speed gimmicks, having to tap a series of buttons quickly, and Doki Doki gimmicks, which are unique in execution. These different forms of attack contribute to the game's active participation during battles, where unlike most traditional RPGs before it, the player would simply choose to attack and it would be executed automatically without player input. Each character can have 4 gimmicks selected for use within battle, with each having a limited number of uses. After all uses of these attacks are depleted, they will all be replenished. Each gimmick can also be adjusted to the player's preference. Individually, gimmicks can be given their own difficulty setting, changing the weapon's damage the higher the difficulty. As you would expect, the higher the difficulty, the harder it is to successfully perform the attack. The player is even able to test how the difficulty will change the attack from their inventory screen. Failing to successfully pull off a gimmick attack will still hit the enemy, however. Gimmicks can also be upgraded with batteries found throughout the journey. After successfully executing gimmick attacks, the player is rewarded a number of stars depending on the gimmick's difficulty setting, contributing to their cool meter, though failing an attack will completely deplete the bar. By filling a certain amount of this bar, a gear will be activated which can be spent executing a cool attack, effectively a team attack which will change depending on which partner is in battle with Demille. The player will obtain not just a variety of different gimmicks on their adventure, but a large array of usable items, as well as gear which can be purchased and equipped. To create new gimmicks, the player has to find hidden items called pacifiers. These can be found while walking around the game's maps, hidden in a variety of places. While individual weapons can be upgraded and gear can be equipped to bolster a character's stats, experience is also earned for each character, and they are capable of leveling. During exploration of the game's maps, there's also the possibility of coming across interactive objects, adding more gameplay to the usually minimally participatory portions of RPGs. These include things like timing button presses for jumps, or simply holding a button to make platforms move. Partway through the adventure, a card-based minigame is unlocked called Gimmicker. After unlocking this minigame, it's possible to duel with or obtain new cards from several characters throughout the player's journey. The objective of the game is to reduce your opponent's health below your own, or to 0. There are 2 types of card. Gimmick cards, based on the various gimmick weapons in the game, used to attack an opponent. These are automatically put on the table and given a rank based on a color seen in the middle of the screen. A higher ranking card will win a round, though green will always beat blue. After gimmick cards are put into play, the player must select a character card from their hand. These cards change the gimmick's stats, such as increasing or decreasing a rank, or changing the attack value. The difference between the attack stat of the two gimmicks in play will be the damage dealt to the losing player of the round. If both cards remain on the same rank, the higher value attack gimmick is deemed the winner of the round. After all of the player's cards in their hand are used, or one player hits 0 health, the game is over. Tomato Adventure was the second title to come from the Alpha Dream studio, being released after Koto Battle Tengai no Moribito for the Game Boy Color. Nintendo approached the team wanting them to develop a new role-playing game under the title Gimmick Land, named after the concept of the game's utilization of gimmicky toys to not just have a game based around turn-based RPG mechanics, but also to introduce more active participation from the player in battle. During this phase of development, the game was being produced for the Game Boy Color, and had made significant progress. Only 2 screenshots are known to exist from the game's earlier Gimmick Land period, though the title was allegedly close to completion and was almost ready for release. That was until Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance. As the gaming community's interest shifted away from the Game Boy Color to the new system, the team was requested by Nintendo to redevelop their game and rename it Tomato Adventure. They had also been instructed to not just rework the quality of the game's visuals and audio, but also introduce a character which would not just reflect the game, but also be easily recognizable and easier to market. In an interview, while discussing how Tomato Adventure came to fruition, Chihiro Fujioka, the game's director, was initially worried about the shift to the new system. However, he also considered this a potential spot of luck, as having a product published on newly released hardware is a good business opportunity. It was also revealed that Gimmicker, the card-based minigame, was created so that the team could test the Game Boy Color's communication features. Originally, players would obtain cards dropped within the world, but Nintendo suggested that this be changed to having the cards be obtained from defeating key characters instead. With the minigame proving to be popular among game testers at Nintendo, this portion of the game was expanded, resulting in shortened dialogue from NPCs to save storage space on the cartridge, allowing the introduction of more diverse elements to Gimmicker. DeMille proved to be a popular character within Nintendo, with many making assumptions that he would be a surefire inclusion into the Super Smash Bros. Series with the release of Brawl on the Wii in 2008. Masahiro Sakurai, the director of Super Smash Bros., had included DeMille twice within polls, asking players who they would like to see added to the game. Despite his double inclusion, he has never made a playable appearance outside of the initial release of Tomato Adventure, though much later he would appear as a spirit within Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. To promote the game's release, Nintendo announced a contest which would see gamers enter a draw for a kilo of famed sweet tomatoes from the Kochi Virtue Valley area of Japan. Superstar Saga actually includes 2 unused musical tracks within its data, which are clearly based upon Tomato Adventure's title music. One of the title's bosses is also incredibly reminiscent of the Yodotsuri enemies found within the sunken ship of Tomato Adventure. Alpha Dream was formed by Chihiro Fujioka in the year 2000 after his departure from Squaresoft. During his tenure with Square, Fujioka worked as the director for Super Mario RPG, his most prominent role within the studio. And thus it is fitting that he would be in charge of Mario's continued ventures into the realm of RPGs. Tomato Adventure proved incredibly popular with not just Japanese audiences and critics, but also the team at Nintendo. After gauging the public's response to the game, Nintendo provided Alpha Dream with the rights to develop their own Mario game, which was soon fleshed out into Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. Superstar Saga has an incredibly strong resemblance to Tomato Adventure, though one major difference between the two was Mario & Luigi's release outside of Japan, plus its incredible popularity, resulting in 4 sequels. The game was at some point set for release within countries other than Japan. In 2019, a prototype ROM was published online which revealed a Chinese localization had been worked on for release on the iQ system, China's alternative to the Game Boy Advance. This ROM was based on a cartridge which had been sent to the Chinese government for review at a time when the country held a strict ban on video games. For more information on that, check out the Did You Know Gaming video on gaming within China. While Tomato Adventure never saw localization in the West, Clyde Tomato Mandolin created a set of tools to work on translation efforts for the title, alongside his own translation of the game's items, enemies, attacks, and menus. Some of the game's early dialogue has also been translated, though not enough to deem the game completely playable without knowledge of Japanese. His inspiration for taking on the project came after the completion of the fan translation for Mother 3, wanting to work on another Nintendo-based RPG with a distinctive style. Plus, his online handle is Tomato, which just seems extremely fitting. After starting work on the translation, Tomato came to realize the project would be as intensive as that of Mother 3. In 2010, he had uploaded his tools to allow others to attempt progress on the project, though to little avail. In 2016, Clyde did a live playthrough of the game on Twitch, using a basic proof-of-concept translation so the audience could follow, receiving suggestions on new names for items, enemies, and the like. In December of 2016, he had completed the game on Twitch, updated his patch and his tools, and uploaded them to his blog, Legends of Localization. When speaking on Superstar Saga's remake with Game Informer, Yoshihiko Mayakawa, a producer at Alpha Dream, was asked why the West never saw a release of Tomato Adventure. He responded, the reason why is the age group we were targeting was a bit too low and a bit too small. We also had some trouble with the battle system, and it wasn't received well at the time of release. Throughout the various interviews conducted for the title, the team would often reiterate that the game was incredibly child-friendly, but that this wouldn't be the only audience who would enjoy it. Despite this, it's very likely that Nintendo had noticed the demographic most drawn to the game in Japan and considered Mario to be a much more marketable venture to undertake and invest into if they intend to publish an RPG in the West.